Imagine standing on a hillside in the west of England just before dawn. The air is cold and damp, the kind of cold that gets into your bones before you even realize it is happening. The grass beneath your feet is wet. Around you, in every direction, the land rolls away in long, dark waves, interrupted only by the black shapes of ancient trees, and, somewhere to the east, the first grey suggestion of light beginning to separate the sky from the earth. You are alone here, or at least you think you are. Then, the sun clears the horizon, and the light falls at exactly the right angle, and you see it. Carved into the hillside below you, enormous beyond anything you were prepared for. A figure. A giant. A man with long, outstretched limbs, and something raised above his head. Cut so deeply into the chalk beneath the turf that the white lines glow in the low morning light, like something that was never meant to be covered over. Nobody knows who made it. Nobody knows when. Nobody knows what it means. And the people who were supposed to know, the people who lived there for generations, the people who told stories around fires for thousands of years, they do not seem to have known either. They inherited it the way you inherit a house whose original owners never left a note. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time is it. Because here is what nobody tells you about Britain before the Romans arrived. There was already something here, something old, something that had been building for thousands of years before Julius Caesar ever set foot on these shores, before the Celts came down from the continent and made this island their own, before anyone we recognize had even heard of this place. There was a civilization here so sophisticated and so strange that the people who came after it, people who were themselves sophisticated and strange, looked at what had been left behind and did not know what to make of it. They wove it into their myths. They built their temples on top of its temples. They whispered about it around fires. And eventually, when they had run out of explanations, they did what humans always do with things they cannot explain. They decided it must have been the gods. What you are about to hear is not a fringe theory. It is not the kind of story that requires you to believe in lost continents or ancient aliens or secret societies. The evidence is sitting right there in the ground, some of it exposed, most of it buried, all of it waiting for people to ask the right questions. Archaeologists have been asking those questions for decades now, and the answers they are getting back are consistently more unsettling than anything anyone expected. The people who built Britain's oldest monuments were not primitive. They were not stumbling around in the dark, banging rocks together and hoping for the best. They were doing something systematic, something coordinated, something that required a level of social organization and astronomical knowledge that would not show up again in Britain for thousands of years. This is their story, or rather, this is as close as we can get to their story, because they left no writing, no names, no language we can recover. All they left was stone and bone and earth. And in that silence, somehow, everything. Picture Britain as it was 9,000 years ago. The ice had retreated only a few thousand years before, scraping the landscape clean, leaving behind a land of birch forests and open water, and animals moving north into newly thawed territory. The sea level was still rising, slowly swallowing what had been a wide low plain connecting this island to the European continent. That plain, which scientists now call Doggerland, was already becoming memory, already turning into myth, already beginning the long process of submergence that would eventually make Britain an island entirely. And the people who lived through that submergence, the people who had walked that plain for generations and then watched it disappear beneath the water, carried something with them. They carried the memory of a world that no longer existed. The shores of Doggerland, before it was lost to the sea, were rich hunting grounds. Rivers ran through its lowlands. Marshes and reed beds teemed with waterfowl. Forests of oak and hazel grew on its higher ground. The animals that moved through it, red deer and wild cattle and elk and horses and wild boar, were prey for the communities who followed them through the seasons. And those communities were not wandering at random. They had territories they returned to, seasonal camps they maintained over generations, sacred places they had been visiting for so long that the visits had become part of what defined them as a people. when the water rose and the land changed around them, when the familiar headlands became islands and the islands became shoals and the shoals disappeared beneath the waves. The people who had organized their world around that landscape had to reorganize themselves. Some moved east onto what would become the continental mainland. Some moved north and west onto higher ground. Some of them, eventually, crossed onto the land that would become Britain. And they brought with them ways of thinking about the relationship between land and sea, and sky, and memory that had been shaped by watching a world end. You cannot watch a world end, slowly and generation by generation, and remain unchanged by it. You cannot inherit from your grandparents stories of forests where there is now open sea and remain indifferent to the passage of time and the permanence of change. The people who carried the memory of Doggerland into the new landscapes they settled were people who understood at a deep level that the world was larger than any individual life and longer than any human memory. That understanding would eventually produce the monuments. The very oldest evidence of intentional structure in Britain does not come from Stonehenge or Avebury or any of the famous sites that draw tourists by the millions. It comes from a field in Aberdeenshire in Scotland, from a site called Warren Field near the village of Craiths. In 2004, aerial photography revealed a set of pits arranged in an arc, 12 pits in a precise curve, aligned in a way that tracked the phases of the moon. When archaeologists excavated those pits and dated the material inside them, they found something that stopped the room. The pits had been dug and used and maintained for an extraordinary span of time. They dated to approximately 8,000 years before the Common Era, which means they are roughly 10,000 years old, which makes them the oldest known lunar calendar in the world. Not in Britain, in the world. Stop for a moment and let that settle. 10,000 years ago, people in what is now Scotland were keeping careful systematic records of the moon's cycle. They were maintaining those records in a fixed location, returning to the same place season after season, adding and modifying the arrangement of pits over a period that archaeologists believe spanned 6,000 years. 6,000 years of returning to the same site to observe and record the same celestial cycle. That is longer than the entire span of recorded history. And we almost missed it entirely. It was only visible from the air, only decipherable once someone had the right tools and the right questions. What were they doing with that lunar knowledge? We do not know for certain. But we can make some educated guesses, and those guesses lead somewhere interesting. Tracking the moon means tracking time. Tracking time in a landscape like Mesolithic Scotland means tracking when the salmon run and when the red deer move and when the wild grain is ready to harvest and when the winter is going to hit, hard enough to kill you if you are not prepared. These were not idle observations. This was information technology. This was the difference between your community surviving the winter and not surviving the winter. And here is the thing about information technology. It requires people who are specifically tasked with managing it. It requires specialists, people whose role within the community is to observe, to record, to remember, to interpret. And if you have specialists, you have a social structure complex enough to support them. You have, in other words, something that looks a lot like civilization. Not civilization in the sense of cities and writing and markets, but civilization in the sense of organized human communities with differentiated roles and shared knowledge systems and the ability to plan across generational timescales. The people at Warren Field were doing all of that 10,000 years ago. And then, over the following millennia, something happened that we are only beginning to understand. The scale got bigger. Move forward in time by about 3,000 years. The exact date matters less than the trajectory. Somewhere around 5,000 to 4,500 years before the Common Era, the kinds of monuments that British people were building changed dramatically. Before that period, there had been long cairns, elongated mounds of stone and earth covering collective burial chambers, impressive in their way, but ultimately local affairs, expressions of a particular community's relationship to its dead. After that period, something else began to appear. Henges, stone circles, causeways, avenues, cursus monuments, those long parallel earthen banks running for miles across the landscape, with no obvious function that anyone has ever been able to agree on. These were not local affairs, these were regional projects. Some of them were continental projects. The Neolithic transition in Britain, the shift from a primarily hunter-gatherer lifestyle to one that incorporated farming and settled communities, happened in stages and was never total. Farming arrived from continental Europe approximately 6,000 years ago, carried by people who brought new domestic animals and new plant varieties, along with new social practices and new cosmological frameworks. But the people who received these arrivals, the hunter-gatherer communities who had inhabited Britain for thousands of years before agriculture, were not passive. They were not simply replaced, or not immediately. There was a period of coexistence and interaction during which ideas and practices flowed both ways, and some of what flowed was the beginning of the monumental tradition. The long barrows that represent the earliest phase of Neolithic monument building in Britain are structurally similar to burial mounds found across northern Europe during the same period, but they are also adapted to the specific landscape and building materials available in Britain. They are not copies, they are translations, a cosmological practice carried from one context into another and transformed in the process. And within a few generations of the first long barrows being built in Britain, something accelerated. The monuments got bigger, the geographic range of the tradition expanded, the social investment required for each new monument grew. It was as if the idea of building on a monumental scale, once introduced, found in the British landscape and the British population conditions that were uniquely favourable to its elaboration. Why Britain? This is a question worth asking, and the answers are not all obvious. Britain has excellent building stone in many locations. It has a climate that, while challenging, is not as extreme as the continental interior and supports a productive agricultural economy, once the right varieties of crops and animals are established. It has river systems and coastlines that allow communication and movement across what are, in geographic terms, significant distances. It has a landscape that is highly varied over short distances, with dramatic hills and wide valleys and prominent ridgelines that present themselves as natural focal points for human attention. But perhaps most importantly, Britain is an island. Or rather, it was in the process of becoming fully an island during the period when the monumental tradition was developing. The rising sea levels that had been ongoing since the end of the last glacial period were, by the time the first Neolithic monuments were being built, nearly complete. Britain was already separated from the continent except at low water. It was a distinct geographical entity, recognizable as such to anyone looking at it from the sea. And that distinctness may have been culturally significant in ways we can barely begin to reconstruct. Being on an island at the edge of the world, in a period when most of the world that mattered to you was accessible by water, creates a particular relationship between a community and its landscape. You know where the edge is, you know what lies beyond it, or you have stories about what lies beyond it. The world has a shape for you in a way that is different from the world of communities who can always move further inland, who have no sea horizon to limit their vision and define their space. And that shaped world, that world with clear edges and a recognizable interior geography, may have been one of the things that made Britain particularly fertile ground for a tradition of landscape monumentalization. When you build something enormous in a landscape, you are saying this place matters. This location, this particular intersection of hills and sky and water and earth is worth this investment. You are creating a center. And creating centers, defining the landscape in terms of places that matter and routes that connect them, is something that communities do when they feel strongly enough about their landscape to commit to it in stone. The stone in the inner circle at Stonehenge did not come from Wiltshire. It came from Wales. Specifically, the blue stones that form the inner ring came from the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, approximately 250 kilometres away as the crow flies, and considerably further by any practical route across the terrain of Neolithic Britain. Moving those stones, which weigh between 2 and 5 tons each, to Salisbury Plain required more than human muscle and willpower. It required logistics. It required planning that extended across seasons and probably across years. It required people to coordinate effort across a geographic distance that was, in the context of the time, enormous. Multiple communities had to agree to this project, contribute to it, sustain it over a period of time that may have stretched across multiple generations. Think about what that means organizationally. Think about what it means in terms of the social relationships required to make it work. Different communities in different landscapes, speaking what may have been different dialects, observing different local customs, maintaining different ancestral relationships to different pieces of land, all working together on a shared project whose meaning they all understood enough to sustain across decades. That is not primitive. That is sophisticated beyond almost anything we give these people credit for. But why those particular stones? The Preseli Hills are not uniquely suitable as a source of building stone. Wiltshire itself has abundant sarsen stone, the grey sandstone that forms the massive outer trilithons of Stonehenge. Using the local sarsen for the main structure makes practical sense. Using bluestones from Wales does not, if the only criterion is building material. There must have been a reason specific to those stones in that specific location. Several researchers have explored this question, and the most interesting answers involve the Preseli Hills themselves, which are a prominent and unusual landscape feature, with a set of specific rocky outcrops, cairn sites perched on the hilltops, that would have been visible from considerable distances, and that may have had a regional sacred significance predating the transportation of the stones. The stones may have been taken not because of their material properties, but because of what they were from, because of the power associated with the place they came from. Bringing the stones to Stonehenge may have been a way of bringing the sacred power of the Preseli Hills to Wiltshire, of creating at Stonehenge a monument that concentrated the sacred geography of the entire region, that was made of all the right places, rather than just whatever stone happened to be nearby. This is a sophisticated cosmological idea. It implies a worldview in which different locations have different sacred qualities, and in which those qualities can be physically transferred, moved from one place to another in the form of the stone itself. The stone is not just building material, it is a carrier of sacred presence. And building with it is not just construction, it is an act of cosmological engineering. And the stones were just the part that survived. We have a tendency to think of prehistoric Britain in terms of what remains, which means we think of it in terms of stone. But most of what those people built was made of wood. There were wooden henge monuments, enormous circles of timber posts erected in the same locations and at the same scales as the stone monuments we still see today. Most of those are gone, rotted away over millennia, visible now only as crop marks from the air or as shadows in the soil when conditions are exactly right. The stone monuments that survived are the exception, not the rule. The actual built landscape of Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain was vastly more extensive than anything we have left. Durrington Walls, the enormous henge enclosure, less than 3 kilometres northeast of Stonehenge, was surrounded by a ditch and bank nearly 5 metres high and covering an area of around 20 hectares. Inside that enclosure, archaeologists have found evidence of the largest known timber structure in Britain. 2 enormous wooden circles of posts, surrounded by smaller structures, all oriented toward the winter sunrise. The scale of Durrington Walls suggests it was not just a monument, it was a settlement, a large, perhaps even permanent settlement. People were living there, cooking there. The bones of pigs and cattle recovered from the site show that animals were being brought in from across Britain, from Wales, from Scotland, from the far north, slaughtered in enormous numbers during what appear to have been seasonal feasts of a scale and regularity that would have required coordination at a geographic level that modern people rarely associate with Neolithic Britain. The isotope analysis of animal teeth recovered from Durrington Walls is particularly revealing. Isotopes in tooth enamel record the chemical composition of the water and soil in the area where an animal grew up, and they differ between different geological regions in predictable ways. When researchers analysed the pig's teeth from Durrington Walls, they found that animals had arrived from as far away as the Scottish Highlands, from Wales, from the far southwest of England. Pigs do not travel those distances on their own. They were driven or carried. by people who had made the journey specifically to participate in whatever was happening at Durrington Walls. People who had come, with their animals, from every corner of the island. The Stonehenge landscape was not just a temple, it was a destination, a place that people travelled to from enormous distances, bringing their animals and their dead and their stories. A centre of something, a capital of something, even if that something does not map neatly onto any category we have for what capitals are supposed to be. And all of this was happening before the people we call the Celts had any presence in Britain at all. The Celts, as a cultural entity, are generally thought to have begun spreading into Britain sometime around 800 years before the Common Era, during what archaeologists call the Iron Age. That is roughly the same period when the Greeks were developing city-states and the Assyrian Empire was at its height. By the time the first Celtic-speaking communities were establishing themselves in Britain, Stonehenge had already been standing for well over 1,000 years. The enormous henge at Avebury, one of the largest stone circles in the world, had been in place for more than 1,500 years. The long barrows and chambered tombs that dot the landscape of Wiltshire and the Cotswolds and the Chalk Downs were already ancient. They were ruins of a world that no one then alive could remember or explain. What did the Celts make of what they found? This is where it gets strange, and where the historical record starts to feel less like a technical problem and more like a ghost story. There is a concept in Celtic mythology and Irish literature called the Sidhe. The word is usually translated as something like fairy mound or spirit hill, and in later medieval texts it refers to the underground dwelling places of supernatural beings, entities who were neither entirely human nor entirely divine, who lived beneath the ancient mounds and could emerge from them at certain times of year, who could lure humans underground or replace human children with changelings or lead unwary travellers into another world from which they might never return. The Sidhe are usually discussed as mythology, as the charming supernatural folklore of ancient Ireland and Scotland, but there is another way to read them. The mounds from which the Sidhe were said to emerge are real. They are the passage tombs and long barrows and chamber cairns built by the people who inhabited Britain and Ireland before the Celts. The most famous example is Newgrange in Ireland, a passage tomb in County Meath that was built around 3,200 years before the Common Era, making it older than the Great Pyramid at Giza. Newgrange is an enormous circular mound, 90 metres in diameter, with a single long passage leading to a cross-shaped chamber at its centre. Once a year, at the winter solstice, the rising sun aligns perfectly with a narrow roof box above the entrance, sending a shaft of light down the full length of the passage to illuminate the chamber at the very back. The alignment is precise to within a minute of arc. It does not happen by accident. The people who built Newgrange knew enough about the movement of the sun to plan a structure around a specific solar event with engineering precision that modern architects still study. They quarried massive stone slabs, some of them from locations more than 50 kilometers away. They decorated many of those slabs with elaborate carved designs, spirals and lozenges, and chevrons and cup marks, an abstract symbolic language that we still cannot read. And then they built their monument and aligned it to catch the solstice light and apparently walked away from it, or were succeeded by people who no longer used it in the same way, leaving it for the people who came after to find and to wonder about. When the Celts came to Ireland and Britain, they found these mounds everywhere. They found them standing in prominent positions on hills and ridgelines. They found them opening onto rivers and streams in locations that clearly had some significance beyond the purely practical. They found them decorated with symbols no one could interpret. And they decided, collectively and over time, that these must be the homes of beings from another world. Not the homes of their own ancestors, because these structures were so old that even the concept of a shared ancestry with their builders was beyond reckoning. The people who built Newgrange had been dead for 2,000 years before a single Celtic word was spoken in Ireland. So the Celts did something that humans always do with things that are too old and too strange and too sophisticated to fit into their current understanding. They made them sacred. They wrapped them in story. They said that powerful beings lived inside those mounds, beings who should be approached with respect and with caution, beings who had knowledge and power that ordinary humans could not access except through very specific rituals at very specific times. And in doing so, they preserved something. They preserved the memory that these places were important, even if they could no longer remember why. The Shide tradition in Irish mythology is extensive and detailed. The beings who inhabited the mounds had names, had histories, had genealogies, and relationships, and rivalries that were as complex as those of any human aristocracy. The Tuatha De Danann, the mythological race who were said to have originally inhabited Ireland before being defeated in battle and retreating underground into the Sida, were described in medieval Irish texts as a people of extraordinary skill and beauty, possessors of magical artifacts, practitioners of arts that no human could match. They were beings from before the current age of the world, survivors of a more perfect time, now living in an underground existence that was simultaneously glorious and sad. It does not take much imagination to see in the Tuatha De Danann a mythologized memory of the people who built the Irish passage tombs. The extraordinary skill attributed to them corresponds to the extraordinary skill embedded in Newgrange and in the other great tombs of the Boyne Valley. The magical artifacts, objects of power that conferred specific abilities or established specific rights, correspond to the elaborate material culture of the Neolithic people. The polished stone axes and jet beads and carved objects that we find in their graves. The underground existence corresponds, simply and directly, to the fact that the monuments the Neolithic people built were largely underground, or at least entered through passages that went beneath the earth. This pattern repeats across the entire landscape of prehistoric Britain, with a consistency that suggests it was not accidental. The great stone circles were incorporated into Celtic religious practice without being fully understood. The chalk figures carved into hillsides were maintained and sometimes augmented by communities who may not have known who originally created them. The long straight tracks called lays, alignments of ancient sites that run for miles across the landscape, continued to be recognized as significant even as the cultures that first established them faded beyond memory. Something was being transmitted. Not understood, maybe, but transmitted. Let us talk about Avebury, because Avebury is in some ways more interesting than Stonehenge, and it is considerably less famous, which means most people miss it entirely. Avebury is a village in Wiltshire, and the village sits inside a stone circle, or rather, inside a series of stone circles inside a henge, which is itself surrounded by a ditch that is still, after 4,500 years, so deep that people have built houses at the bottom of it. The outer stone circle at Avebury is the largest in the world. It originally consisted of around 98 standing stones, some of them weighing more than 40 tons, arranged in a ring with a diameter of approximately 331 meters. Inside that outer ring were two smaller stone circles, each of which was itself a significant monument by any standard you care to apply. The whole complex was connected by stone avenues, long processional approaches lined with standing stones running for miles into the surrounding landscape, linking Avebury to other significant sites in the area. The earthworks at Avebury required the removal of approximately 200,000 tons of chalk. This was done with tools made of deer, antler, and ox shoulder blade. The ditch that was cut around the outer henge is 21 meters wide at the top and 9 meters deep in places, which means it is deep enough to bury a 3-story building. The banks on either side of that ditch were raised from the excavated material, originally rising to perhaps 11 meters above the surrounding land, making Avebury visible from an enormous distance. This was not a project that a single community undertook on a whim. This was a generational investment of staggering proportions, and we do not know why. We do not know what happened inside that enclosure. We do not know what the stone circles meant or what rituals were performed within them. We know that people gathered at Avebury from very great distances. We know that in the later part of the monument's active life, there is evidence of feasting on a significant scale. We know that the site was in continuous use for at least 1,000 years, which means it retained its significance across an enormous span of time. But the specific meaning, the thing that made it worth all of that effort, is lost. What we do know is that when the medieval Christian church was trying to suppress the older religious practices associated with sites like Avebury, local communities actively resisted. There is documented evidence of a conflict at Avebury in the 14th century in which local villagers began toppling and burying the standing stones, apparently in an attempt to neutralize what they still regarded as a site of dangerous supernatural power. One of those stones, a large sarsen that was buried during this period, fell on a man and crushed him. Archaeologists found his skeleton pinned beneath the stone when it was excavated in the 1930s. He had tools in his pockets that suggested he was a barber surgeon, possibly someone brought in as a specialist to perform a ritual neutralization of the stone. He failed. The point is that in the 14th century, more than 3,500 years after Avebury was built, local people were still treating it as a site of active supernatural power that needed to be dealt with, not as a historical curiosity, not as a ruin from an incomprehensible past, as something present and potent and real. That is a remarkable degree of cultural memory to maintain across such an enormous span of time, even if the original meaning had been completely lost and replaced by something else. The story of Avebury does not begin and end with the henge itself. The surrounding landscape is saturated with prehistoric activity in a way that takes years of study to fully appreciate. Silbury Hill, less than 2 kilometers south of the Avebury Henge, is the largest man-made mound in Europe. It stands around 37 meters high and covers an area of about 2 hectares. It was built in stages over a period of centuries, beginning somewhere around 2,400 years before the Common Era. Despite multiple archaeological investigations, including a major excavation in the 1850s and a substantial research project in the 1960s and 70s, nobody has ever found anything inside Silbury Hill. No burial, no artifact deposit, no chamber or passage. Just chalk and clay and soil built up in careful layers to create a structure that, in terms of sheer volume of material moved, rivals the smaller Egyptian pyramids. What is Silbury Hill for? Nobody knows. Theories have included a burial mound for a king whose burial chamber was missed or robbed, a marker or territorial beacon, an artificial hill designed to mirror the natural hills of the surrounding landscape, and a monument designed to be seen from a specific angle in relation to the Avebury Henge. What we do know is that it was built with extraordinary care and skill, that the internal structure is complex enough to have maintained its shape for 4,500 years without significant collapse, and that it clearly mattered enormously to the people who built it. You do not move that much chalk with antler picks unless whatever you are building serves a purpose that your community regards as essential. Near Avebury stands the West Kennet Long Barrow, one of the largest Neolithic burial chambers in Britain. It was built around 3,600 years before the Common Era, predating the Avebury Henge by over 1,000 years, which means that when the builders of Avebury arrived to begin their work on the henge, they were already living in a landscape that contained ancient monuments built by their own predecessors. The Long Barrow was still in use during the period when the henge was being built, still receiving new burials and deposits, still serving as a point of connection between the living community and its ancestors. The chambers inside West Kennet are defined by enormous standing stones, some of them over 3 meters tall, arranged to create a series of interconnected spaces within the mound. The entrance passage is long and low, requiring visitors to crouch or crawl to enter. The chambers at the end are larger, allowing people to stand upright, but still enclosed and dark. To be inside West Kennet is to be in a fundamentally different kind of space from the open air outside. Sound behaves differently. Light is absent. The temperature is lower. The sense of being in an enclosed underground world is complete. After the monument was no longer used for burial, its forecourt, the open area in front of the entrance, was deliberately blocked with enormous stones. This blocking took place around 2,000 years before the Common Era, and it appears to have been done carefully, even ceremonially, rather than hastily. The monument was not abandoned. It was closed. There is a distinction there that matters, even if we can no longer be sure what it meant to the people who made it. We need to talk about the chalk figures, because they are one of the strangest and most underappreciated aspects of this story. Britain has a number of very large figures carved into chalk hillsides. The technique is straightforward enough. You remove the turf and the thin soil layer to expose the white chalk beneath, and if the figure is large enough and the hillside steep enough, it is visible from an enormous distance. But keeping a chalk figure visible requires continuous maintenance. Turf and scrub grow back. Chalk weathers and softens. Without regular cleaning and recutting, a chalk figure disappears into the landscape within a matter of decades. The chalk figures that still exist, or that were still visible before they were restored, were maintained continuously for centuries, sometimes for millennia. The Long Man of Wilmington in East Sussex is a good example. The figure, which depicts an outline of a man holding two long staffs, is carved into the chalk of Windover Hill. The earliest clear documentary reference to it dates from the late 17th century, but there are suggestions it may be considerably older. Some analyses have proposed a prehistoric origin, which would mean that communities in the Sussex Downs maintained this figure, kept it clean and visible, for an extraordinary span of time, perhaps without fully understanding who had originally created it or what it was intended to depict. The Uffington White Horse in Oxfordshire is better dated. Recent scientific analysis has placed its creation somewhere between 1300 and 800 years before the Common Era, which makes it roughly 3,000 years old. It is a genuinely strange figure when you look at it closely. It does not look like a horse in the way that a naturalistic representation of a horse would look. It is abstracted, stylized, composed of sweeping curved forms that look more like calligraphy than like a picture. Some researchers have suggested it represents not a horse, but a dragon, or possibly a solar symbol, or possibly a marker of territorial identity for the people of the region. Others have pointed out that from most ground-level vantage points, the Uffington White Horse is not properly visible. To see the full figure, you need to be at height or at a specific distance. It was designed to be seen from a particular angle or from a particular elevation. Who designed it that way? Who had both the aesthetic vision to create a figure that's sophisticated and the surveying knowledge to lay it out accurately at that scale? These are not questions we associate with Bronze Age Britain, but they should be. Because here is the thing about the Uffington White Horse. It is not just a figure carved in chalk. Below the horse's head is a flat-topped mound known as Dragon Hill. Where nothing grows, the chalk kept bare over centuries of conscious maintenance. Nearby is a Bronze Age hill fort called Uffington Castle. Nearby is a long barrow called Wayland's Smithy, which is a chambered megalithic tomb built around 3,700 years before the Common Era, making it older than the horse by well over 1,000 years, and the area was a significant site of ritual activity for an even longer period than that, stretching back into the Neolithic. The White Horse was not an isolated creation. It was part of a landscape that had been deliberately organized and maintained as a sacred territory for thousands of years. Wayland's Smithy is worth spending time with in its own right. It is a Neolithic long barrow of the type that archaeologists call a Cotswold Seven Cairn, a stone-built burial chamber beneath a long mound of earth. It was built in two phases. The first phase, dated to around 3,500 years before the Common Era, was a smaller, simpler structure covering a timber burial chamber. The second phase, which was built over and around the first, is the imposing monument that stands today. 4 large standing stones define the entrance facade. Behind them, a passage leads into a cruciform chamber with 3 side cells, similar in plan to Newgrange and to other passage tombs of the same period. The site was given its present name in the medieval period. According to Anglo-Saxon tradition, Wayland's Smithy was the workshop of Welland, the smith, a supernatural craftsman of extraordinary skill who lived underground and would shoe your horse overnight if you left it at the entrance with a silver coin. The tradition is clearly ancient, clearly pre-Christian in its origins, and clearly attached to this specific location. It is not a story that travelled to this place. It is a story that grew here. And what it grew from, almost certainly, is the experience of encountering an ancient underground structure in the landscape, a structure whose original builders and purpose were completely unknown and needing to explain what it was and who lived in it. The answer the Anglo-Saxons came up with, a supernatural craftsman of exceptional skill, working underground in an ancient monument is actually not a bad interpretation of what they were looking at. Someone of exceptional skill had indeed built this structure. They had worked underground, or at least within the enclosed space of the chamber, and the quality of their work was extraordinary enough to imply capabilities beyond the ordinary. The name they chose, Wayland or Welland, is significant. Wieland the Smith is one of the most ancient figures in Germanic and Norse mythology, a figure whose origins predate any of the Germanic settlement of Britain. His attachment to this specific Neolithic monument suggests that the site had sacred significance, continuous enough that incoming Anglo-Saxon communities arriving in Britain after the Roman period recognized it and gave it a name from their own mythological tradition. The tradition attached to the place had survived the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Roman period, and continued into the early medieval. That is a span of more than 3,000 years of maintained cultural significance. Now let us go deeper into what these builders actually knew. Because the astronomical knowledge embedded in the British megalithic monuments is, when you start to pull on the thread, genuinely astonishing. Stonehenge is famous for its solstice alignment, but that is actually one of the simpler alignments in the British megalithic tradition. The alignment of Stonehenge toward the midsummer sunrise has been known since the 18th century and is relatively straightforward. What is less well known is the extraordinary precision of certain other alignments, and what that precision implies about the observational methods and the astronomical knowledge of the people who created them. Callanish in the Outer Hebrides is a standing stone complex on the Isle of Lewis. It consists of a central circle of 13 stones from which 4 stone avenues radiate in roughly the 4 cardinal directions, creating a cross-shaped layout that is unique among British prehistoric monuments. The monument was erected around 4,800 years ago, making it roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of Stonehenge. And it is aligned not to the solar solstice, but to the lunar major standstill. The lunar major standstill is a phenomenon that occurs on an 18.6-year cycle. During the major standstill, the moon reaches the most extreme positions of its arc across the sky, rising and setting at points on the horizon that it will not visit again for another 18.5 years. At Callanish, because of the specific latitude of the site and the specific profile of the hills that form the southern skyline, the major standstill moon at its southernmost extreme appears to skim along the tops of those hills and then set into the central chamber of the monument in a way that is spectacularly dramatic. The effect, which happens only during the major standstill period and only in specific years within that period, and which lasts for only a short time, would have been extraordinary to witness. The full moon appearing to walk along the tops of the hills and then descend into the stone circle would have looked, in certain conditions, like the moon landing inside the monument. To design a monument for this alignment, you need to know several things. You need to know about the 18.6-year lunar cycle. You need to understand how to observe and predict the extreme points of that cycle. You need to know the precise topography of your local horizon in enough detail to calculate where the major standstill moon will rise and set. You need to be able to translate that knowledge into a physical structure with sufficient accuracy that the alignment still holds more than 4,000 years later. All of that requires sustained observational astronomy conducted over multiple generations. To observe the lunar major standstill and understand it as a cycle, you need to watch the moon for at least 19 years, probably longer. To understand it well enough to predict its extreme positions, you need to have been watching for multiple cycles. The knowledge embedded in the Callanish alignment is not something that anyone could have developed in a single generation. It is the product of an astronomical tradition that must have been maintained and transmitted across many generations, possibly across centuries. And then someone used that knowledge to build something that would demonstrate at the moment of the major standstill exactly what they knew. What does that mean in social terms? Who in a prehistoric community has the role of carrying multi-generational astronomical knowledge? Who makes the observations, records the results, transmits the information to the next generation, and eventually produces the calculations necessary to design a monument aligned to a 19-year cycle? This is not a role that farmers or hunters would have time for in the margins of daily life. This is a full-time specialization. This is a priestly class, or an astronomical class, or some combination of the two. Somebody in Neolithic Britain had a job. That job was the sky, and they were very, very good at it. The recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire represent yet another tradition of sophisticated astronomical alignment. These are a specific regional type of stone circle found almost exclusively in northeast Scotland, characterized by a large recumbent stone, lying on its side, flanked by two tall flanking stones, always positioned in the southern arc of the circle. The recumbent stone and its flankers form a kind of natural sightline, a framing device, and what they frame in essentially every recumbent stone circle that has been studied for its astronomical properties is the moon at its southern extreme during the major standstill period. The moon rises, moves across the sky, and at some point appears to roll along the top of the recumbent stone, framed between the two flankers. The effect is local to the specific latitude of Aberdeenshire and to the specific relationship between the stone arrangement and the local horizon. What this means is that someone, or some community, in northeast Scotland, sometime around 3,000 years before the Common Era, developed not just an awareness of the lunar major standstill, but a specific, sophisticated, reproducible technology for observing it. A technology that was then built into stone circles across an entire region. This is not one person having one insight. This is a regional tradition of astronomical practice that was coherent enough to produce the same solution in the same form across multiple sites over a period of centuries. That is curriculum. That is knowledge transmission at a level of consistency and rigor that implies institutional structures for maintaining it. The Ness of Brodgar in Orkney is one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of recent decades. Located on a narrow strip of land between two lochs near the Great Henge of the Ring of Brodgar and the slightly older stones of Stennis, the Ness of Brodgar turns out to be, as far as archaeologists can tell, a complex of monumental buildings that were in continuous use for around 500 years between approximately 3,300 and 2,800 years before the Common Era. The buildings are substantial, stone-built structures with decorated walls and evidence of sophisticated roof construction. Some of them had walls that still stand to considerable height after 5,000 years, which tells you something about the quality of the construction. The interiors show evidence of repeated feasting and deposition on a very large scale. The structural remains at the Ness of Brodgar include a building known as Structure 10 that is large enough to have served as a communal hall with internal divisions suggesting specific areas for specific activities. The walls were decorated with painted designs in red and yellow pigment, designs that appear to relate to the carved decorations on the standing stones of the nearby Ring of Brodgar. This decorative coherence between different monument types across the same landscape suggests a unified visual culture, a set of shared symbols whose meanings were understood across the community and possibly across the wider regional network. The final phase of the Ness of Brodgar's active life appears to have ended with a deliberate ceremony of closure. A very large number of cattle were slaughtered, their remains deposited across the site in a way that suggests a feast of extraordinary scale, possibly the largest feast yet documented in Neolithic Britain. And then the site was sealed, covered, decommissioned in a way that mirrors the closure of West Kennet Long Barrow. The ending was as deliberate as the beginning. Why was the Ness of Brodgar decommissioned? The timing corresponds roughly to the arrival of the beaker-associated population in Britain, which raises the possibility that the closure of the site was connected to the social and political disruptions of that transition. But we should be careful about assuming causation. The site may have run its natural course independently of any external pressure. Communities that invest in ceremonial centres often eventually divest from them, moving on to new forms and new locations as their cosmological frameworks evolve. What the Ness of Brodgar demonstrates, perhaps more clearly than any other single site, is that Neolithic Britain had centres of genuine institutional complexity. Not just individual monuments, but organized communities with differentiated roles. with material resources sufficient to support non-agricultural specialists, with a long-range trading network that brought objects and perhaps people from across the British Isles and possibly beyond. This was not a landscape of scattered villages, each doing their best in isolation. This was an interconnected world with its own infrastructure and its own hierarchy and its own centers of power. Let us come now to the genetics, because the genetics tell a story that almost nobody anticipated and that changes everything about how we understand the transition from the megalithic builders to the Celts. For most of the 20th century, the prevailing model of prehistoric Britain was essentially a continuity model. The idea was that Neolithic farmers arrived in Britain from continental Europe around 6,000 years ago, displacing or absorbing the earlier hunter-gatherer population, and that these farming communities then built the megalithic monuments we associate with the period. The Beaker people, who arrived around 4,400 years ago with a new material culture, characterized by distinctive pottery and metal objects, were thought to have added a new layer to an essentially continuous population. What ancient DNA has told us over the past decade is radically different. Analysis of ancient human remains from Britain has revealed that the arrival of Beaker-associated ancestry, approximately 4,400 years ago, was not a gentle cultural exchange. It was, in population genetic terms, a near-complete replacement. Within a few generations of the Beaker people arriving in Britain, the people who had built Stonehenge and Avebury, and the Long Barrows and the Cursus monuments were gone. Not culturally subsumed, not gradually assimilated, gone. The genetic signal of the Neolithic farmers who built these monuments largely disappears from the British population within 2 or 3 centuries. What replaced it was a population that was predominantly derived from the continental Beaker culture, which was itself ultimately derived from populations from the Pontic steppe. This is one of the most dramatic population replacements in the prehistoric record of anywhere in the world, and it happened here, on this island, in this landscape full of these enormous monuments. And the people who did it, the people who arrived and replaced the builders, did not destroy the monuments. They used them. They continued to bury their dead at and near the old sites. They modified some of them, adding new elements, extending the existing sacred landscape rather than obliterating it, which means that the new population, whatever they thought of the builders, recognized the power of the places those builders had created. Why did they not tear them down? Why, if you have just effectively removed an entire population from a landscape, would you maintain and continue to use the religious infrastructure of that population? One possibility is pragmatic. The monuments were enormous. Tearing them down would have required as much effort as building them. It was easier to repurpose them. But there is another possibility, and it is more interesting. The monuments may have worked. That is, the specific astronomical alignments and the acoustic properties and the spatial organization of sites like Stonehenge and Avebury may have done something in practice that the new arrivals found immediately meaningful. The winter solstice sunrise alignment at Stonehenge is not culturally specific, it is astronomically specific. Whatever community is standing inside that monument at dawn on the winter solstice, whatever language they speak, whatever gods they worship, they will see the sun rise and its first light enter the monument in a way that appears designed for precisely that moment. The power of the site does not depend on knowing who built it. It depends on being there. Perhaps the Beaker people stood at Stonehenge at the winter solstice and understood that whoever had built this place had understood something profound about the relationship between the earth and the sky. And perhaps that understanding was enough. The Beaker people brought with them new objects, new practices, and probably new ideas. The copper daggers and arrowheads that appear in Beaker burials represent the arrival of metallurgy in Britain, and metallurgy changes everything. Metal can be cast into shapes that stone cannot achieve. Metal tools are sharper, stronger, more durable, and can be remade when they break. Metal weapons represent a genuine technological advantage in conflict. And metal objects, rare and valuable, and capable of being made only by specialists with specific knowledge of ore sources and smelting techniques, immediately create new kinds of social differentiation. Beaker burials are individual burials, a striking contrast to the collective burial practices of the Neolithic, where the builders of the long barrows placed their dead communally, mixing the bones of multiple individuals in shared chambers that emphasized collective identity over individual distinction. The Beaker people buried their dead singly, often with elaborate grave goods, often in a crouched position that some have interpreted as a sleeping or fetal posture. The individual is honored. The individual is marked as significant. The individual is accompanied into whatever comes next by objects that spoke to their identity and their status. This shift from collective to individual burial is not just a change in funeral practice. It is a change in social philosophy. It reflects a world in which individual identity matters more, in which status and distinction are important enough to be marked in death as well as in life, in which the social hierarchy that emerges with metallurgy and with the new forms of political organization that metal enables is beginning to crystallize. And yet the new population used the old monuments, stood in the stone circles the Neolithic builders had erected, built barrows on the same ridgelines where the long barrows of their predecessors still stood, maintained the sacred geography of the landscape even as they transformed the social structure that had originally given that geography its meaning. This is deeply human behavior. Sacred places outlast the traditions that created them. We still build churches on sites that were sacred before Christianity. We still celebrate seasonal festivals with customs that predate the religions that claimed them. The human tendency to recognize and maintain a sacred place is persistent, even when the specific theology changes beyond recognition. The Bronze Age that followed the Beaker transition was a period of considerable complexity in Britain, one that we tend to underestimate because the written record does not yet exist. But the material evidence tells a story of active long-distance trade, sophisticated craft production, and social organization, capable of sustaining both the continuation of the megalithic tradition in modified forms and the development of new types of monument and new forms of social expression. The Bronze Age round barrows that dot the landscape of southern England and are visible as small mounds on hundreds of hilltops are, individually, unimpressive compared to the great Neolithic monuments. But their distribution tells an important story. They are not random. They cluster in patterns that suggest the deliberate organization of a visible territorial landscape. Prominently placed barrows on ridgelines and hilltops that could be seen from miles away functioned as markers of territorial claims, ancestral presences watching over the land below. To stand in a Bronze Age landscape and look up at a ridgeline studded with burial mounds is to read a text, even if you cannot understand the specific claims being made. The Bronze Age also saw the development of a new type of monument that has received less attention than it deserves. The Stone Rows of Dartmoor in Devon are among the most extensive monument systems in Britain, consisting of parallel rows of small standing stones running for significant distances across the moorland. The longest row runs for about 3.5 kilometres. There are dozens of individual rows on Dartmoor, often associated with burial cairns and other features, and their precise purpose is as unclear as that of the Cursus monuments of the Neolithic. They are alignments, they are directions, they point somewhere. But where they are pointing and why are questions that remain genuinely open. The bronze tools and weapons that characterize the period also tell us something about the networks that were maintaining the civilization of Bronze Age Britain. Tin, which is necessary for making bronze, is found in Cornwall and in Wales, but not in most of the rest of Britain. Copper is found in Wales and in Ireland and in Scotland. Making bronze requires access to both materials, which means either long-distance trade in raw materials or long-distance trade in finished objects, or both. The evidence shows that both happened. Bronze objects of types produced in one region of Britain are found throughout the island. Objects produced in Ireland turn up in mainland Britain and vice versa. Objects from continental Europe appear in British contexts. Britain is embedded in a trading world that spans not just the island, but the wider North Atlantic and Channel region. This trading world requires communication. It requires knowledge of routes and weather and the locations of resources and the identities and trustworthiness of potential trading partners. It requires language, not necessarily a shared language, but sufficient common ground for the kinds of transaction that trade requires. And it requires institutions that can guarantee the terms of exchange, that can resolve disputes, that can maintain the relationships of trust across the distances and the time periods involved. We have no documentation of any of this, but the objects tell us it existed. The Cursus monuments deserve special attention because they are among the most genuinely mysterious features of the prehistoric British landscape, and they are almost completely absent from popular accounts of Neolithic Britain. A cursus is a type of monument consisting of two parallel earthen banks with external ditches, running for considerable distances across the landscape. The word cursus was given to them in the 18th century by the antiquarian William Stockley, who thought they might have been used for chariot racing, which is incorrect but at least tells you something about their scale. The Stonehenge cursus, which runs roughly east to west, just north of Stonehenge itself, is approximately 3 kilometers long and 100 meters wide. The Dorset cursus is the largest known, running for approximately 10 kilometers across the chalk downland of Cranbourne Chase. Nobody knows what cursus monuments were for. This is stated plainly in the archaeological literature without much embarrassment, which is unusual and telling. Archaeologists are generally good at coming up with functional explanations for ancient structures, even tentative ones. The fact that the Cursus monuments have resisted this process for 200 years of serious investigation suggests that whatever they were for does not map onto any category of human activity that modern people readily recognize. Some things we do know. Cursus monuments are often aligned to prominent landscape features, hills or rivers or other monuments. They are often associated with long barrow burial mounds, which are sometimes found at their ends or incorporated into their layout. They tend to be oriented roughly east to west, which suggests some relationship to the rising and setting sun. And they appear, from the pattern of construction and modification, to have been used over long periods of time, with their interiors kept deliberately clear of any permanent structures, which implies they were spaces rather than buildings. Some researchers have proposed that Cursus monuments were processional routes, paths designed to be walked in a specific direction as part of a ritual journey. Others have suggested they were designed to channel or contain supernatural power, to direct spiritual forces through the landscape. Some have pointed out that the interiors of Cursus monuments create a kind of bounded visual corridor, a section of landscape that is cut off from the surrounding terrain by the banks on either side, which would have created a peculiar sensory experience for anyone walking inside. You would have been in the landscape, but not quite of it, contained in a long thin world, with sky above and earthen walls on either side. Whatever they were, they required extraordinary effort to build. The Dorset Cursus, if you calculate the volume of earth moved to construct its banks and ditches, represents millions of person-hours of labor. Spread over the presumably considerable time period of construction, that is still an enormous ongoing community investment. Communities were choosing to spend their labor on this rather than on other things. What does it tell us about the priorities of these people that they chose to build Cursus monuments? It tells us that the relationship between the living world and whatever lay beyond the visible was, for them, a practical concern that required infrastructure. They were not just thinking about it, they were building for it. Now let us think about what all of this looks like from the outside. What it looks like to someone arriving in this landscape without the knowledge to understand it. When Celtic-speaking communities first encountered the megalithic landscape of Britain and Ireland, they encountered it in the condition it was in around 800 to 500 years before the Common Era, which means most of these monuments had been in place for between 1,500 and 3,000 years. By that point, many of them would have been in various states of decay or ruin. Long barrows would have had their covering stones exposed. Stone circles would have had some stones fallen or missing. The earthworks of the henges would have been softened and partially overgrown, but the scale would still have been unmistakable, and the astronomical alignments would still have worked. Imagine arriving in a new landscape and discovering that it is covered with enormous structures, some of them the size of hills, none of them belonging to any building tradition you recognize, some of them clearly aligned to astronomical events in ways that imply a detailed knowledge of the sky. Imagine discovering that at the winter solstice, a beam of sunlight enters the interior of a chamber inside one of those mounds and illuminates carvings that no one now living has made. Imagine finding that at a specific point in the lunar cycle, the full moon appears to descend into a circle of stones in a way that no natural process would produce. You would have questions, and if the landscape you came from had no parallel for any of this, your questions would quickly become something closer to awe. And then, because awe that cannot be explained becomes dangerous, something closer to fear. The Celtic traditions around the Shida were not originally charming folklore about little people with fairy dust. They were accounts of powerful and potentially hostile entities who had claims on the landscape that predated any Celtic presence. The Shida were the original inhabitants, or the spiritual representatives of the original inhabitants, and their continued existence inside the mounds was a reminder that the Celts were newcomers in a land that had been shaped by others. The correct response to this was not to challenge or dismiss those earlier presences, but to acknowledge them, to maintain appropriate boundaries, to perform the right rituals at the right times, to ensure that the powers inside the mounds remained quiescent. This is not primitive thinking. This is actually a rather sophisticated response to a genuine archaeological and cultural situation. The Celts had inherited a landscape they did not fully understand, and they had developed a set of practices designed to manage their relationship with that landscape in a way that minimized risk and maintained social stability. The stories about the cedar served a practical function. They encoded information about which places were sacred, what behaviors were appropriate near those places, and what the consequences of disrespect might be. In the absence of any direct knowledge of who had built the monuments or why, this was a reasonable way to handle the situation. The Druids present a particular puzzle in this context. The Druidic tradition, as far as we can reconstruct it from classical sources and from the limited Irish and Welsh texts that preserve traces of pre-Christian religious practice, was a priestly and scholarly class whose knowledge encompassed astronomy, natural philosophy, law, genealogy, poetry, and the management of relationships between the human world and whatever lay beyond it. Classical authors who encountered the Druids in Gaul and Britain were consistently struck by their learning and by the length and rigor of their training, which was said to require up to 20 years of intensive study. What was in that 20 years of study? The sources are frustratingly vague. We know there was astronomy because multiple classical authors mention it, and because the celestial knowledge embedded in the Celtic calendar system, fragments of which survive in inscriptions from Gaul, is sophisticated. We know there was cosmology, a systematic account of the structure of the world and its relationship to other worlds. We know there was a large corpus of traditional knowledge, transmitted orally in verse form, apparently because memorizing verse was more reliable than any physical record. But here is the question that nobody quite asks. Where did the Druidic astronomical tradition come from? Classical sources consistently place the origin of the Druids in Britain rather than in continental Gaul, even though the Celts of Gaul had their own Druids. The implication is that Britain was the mother tradition, the place where Druidism originated or where its highest form was practiced, and that Gaulish Druids who wanted advanced training travelled to Britain to receive it. If you are looking for a reason why Britain in particular would be the origin point of a sophisticated astronomical and cosmological tradition, you could do a lot worse than pointing at the megalithic landscape. The people who eventually became or were absorbed into the Druidic tradition may have been the inheritors, however imperfectly, of an astronomical knowledge tradition, stretching back to the people who built Stonehenge and Callanish and Newgrange. Not the direct descendants, because the genetic record tells us the builders were largely replaced, but the inheritors of a practice. There is a concept in archaeological theory called structural memory. The idea is that buildings and landscapes encode information about how to use them, what they are for, what behaviors are appropriate within them. You do not need to be told what a church is for if you have grown up in a society that has churches. The architecture communicates it. And something similar may have operated in the megalithic landscape. The monuments communicated their own purpose, or something close to it, to anyone who spent enough time in and around them and who was open to what they might be communicating. We know that people went to Stonehenge for millennia after the main building phases were complete. We know they performed ceremonies there, that they continued to add to and modify the monument, that it remained a living site of religious activity, rather than becoming merely a ruin. The knowledge that it had been built to observe the sky was presumably obvious to anyone who stood inside it at the right moment. The knowledge that it had been built as a place where the living met the dead was written in the bones of the people, buried in and around it over many centuries. Perhaps the Druids, or the people who became the Druids, simply paid attention, and perhaps what they found when they paid attention was enough to anchor an entire tradition. The hill forts of Iron Age Britain represent a different kind of monument than the Neolithic and Bronze Age sites, but they reflect the same underlying commitment to large-scale construction as a social and political strategy. Maiden Castle in Dorset is one of the most impressive, a massive defended settlement covering nearly 47 acres, with elaborate multiple ramparts that would have made direct assault extraordinarily costly. The earthworks were added to and improved over many centuries, with the most complex defensive arrangements dating to the last few centuries before the Common Era. The labour invested in Maiden Castle over the span of its development approaches. In total, the labour invested in some of the great Neolithic monuments. Inside Maiden Castle, at its peak, a substantial community lived and worked. Evidence of regular roundhouse settlements, grain storage pits, metalworking, weaving, and a range of other craft activities suggests a population of several thousand people. The grain storage pits are particularly interesting. They represent a system of collective food storage, operating at a scale that goes beyond what any single household or extended family could manage. Someone was coordinating the storage and presumably the distribution of food across the community. Someone was making decisions about how much to store and when to release it. That is an administrative function. That is a state in embryonic form, or at least a proto-state, a social entity complex, enough to coordinate a resource management across a large population. Danebury Hill Fort in Hampshire has been excavated more thoroughly than almost any other Iron Age site in Britain, and the picture that has emerged from those excavations is of a highly organised enclosed settlement, with evidence of systematic grain storage, metalworking, religious activity, and a street layout suggesting planned rather than organic development. Danebury had shrines within its interior, defined ritual spaces that were used for deposits of animal bones and other offerings on a regular basis. The shrines were maintained over long periods, suggesting continuity of religious practice and probably of religious organization. The material culture of Danebury and of comparable sites shows that Iron Age Britain was embedded in a continental trading network of considerable sophistication. Imported wine amphora from the Mediterranean, fine pottery from Gaul, metal objects from multiple European traditions, British exports, primarily metals and agricultural products, and possibly slaves, moving in the other direction. This was not isolated provincial life. This was active participation in a trading world that extended from Britain to the Mediterranean. What the Romans who arrived in Britain found was not a primitive society stunned by their sophistication. It was a complex society with its own institutions, its own knowledge systems, its own political structures, and its own already deeply sophisticated relationship with its own past. The Romans brought writing, which is to say, they brought the technology of making that complexity visible to people who were not directly embedded in it, but the complexity had been there for a very long time. When Caesar wrote about Britain in his account of the Gallic Wars, he described a society with a druidic tradition that he found genuinely impressive, a political structure based on tribal territories and client relationships that he understood well enough to exploit diplomatically, and a military capability he underestimated badly enough that his first two expeditions were considerably more difficult than he had anticipated. The picture he paints is not of a primitive people stunned by Roman sophistication. It is of a sophisticated people whose sophistication operated on different principles than Roman sophistication. And underneath that Iron Age sophistication, in the landscape itself, in the monuments and the alignments and the sacred geography of hills and waters, the earlier civilization was still present, still working, still doing whatever it had always done at the solstice and the equinox and the major lunar standstill, still communicating in stone and in the angle of sunlight and in the positions of stones on hillsides, the things that its builders had thought important enough to encode in the hardest materials they could find. The Roman conquest of Britain, which began in earnest under Emperor Claudius in 43 of the Common Era, brought a new set of eyes to this ancient landscape. The Romans were sophisticated observers of the cultures they conquered, partly from genuine intellectual curiosity and partly from the practical recognition that understanding a subject population made them easier to govern. What the Roman writers said about Britain and the Britons is therefore worth taking seriously, even allowing for the cultural bias inherent in their perspective. The consistent thread running through Roman accounts of Britain is the island's antiquity, its sense of being somehow older and stranger than the Mediterranean world the Romans knew. The sacred groves of the Druids, the ancient sanctuaries associated with gods the Romans recognized by analogy but understood only imperfectly. The local traditions around springs and hills and stones that persisted even after Roman administrative structures had been imposed on the landscape. All of this communicated to Roman observers that they were dealing with something that had deep roots. The Romans were also acute observers of landscape and structure. The technical aspects of the monuments they encountered, the precision of the stone cutting, the scale of the earthworks, would have been immediately appreciable to a culture that had itself built extensively in stone and earth. Roman engineers examining Stonehenge would have understood, perhaps better than most modern tourists, exactly how difficult the engineering had been. They might not have understood the purpose, but they would have recognized the competence. There are Roman period finds from Stonehenge itself, Roman coins, Romano-British pottery, evidence of activity at the site during the period of Roman occupation. Someone was still going there, still treating it as a place that mattered, whether that was Romano-British people continuing their ancestral practices, or Roman visitors performing their own form of reverential curiosity, or both. The site retained its magnetism even through the transformation of British society under Roman administration. The sacred water landscape of Britain gets particular attention in both Celtic and Roman sources. Rivers and springs were sacred across the Celtic world, and in Britain, this tradition was especially rich. The practice of depositing valuable objects in rivers and lakes and bogs, what archaeologists call votive deposition, was widespread throughout the British Iron Age and Bronze Age. Weapons and jewellery and food, and in some cases human bodies, were placed in wet places, not accidentally, but deliberately, as offerings to whatever powers were understood to inhabit those locations. The rivers, Thames and Witham and Severn, have yielded extraordinary quantities of Bronze Age and Iron Age metalwork from what are clearly deliberately chosen deposition points. The River Thames alone has produced hundreds of swords, shields, and other weapons from the Bronze and Iron Ages, placed in the river in a pattern that is clearly intentional and clearly sustained over many centuries. The famous Waterloo helmet, one of the finest examples of Celtic metalworking ever found in Britain, came from the Thames near Waterloo Bridge. It was not lost, it was placed. What is the theology behind votive deposition in water? The most straightforward interpretation is that water bodies, rivers and lakes and springs were understood as boundaries between the ordinary world and other realms. To deposit something valuable in a river was to send it across that boundary, to give it to whatever powers inhabited the world on the other side. The gifts were not wasted. They entered a different kind of economy, the economy of relationship between humans and the sacred. The Romans who arrived in Britain found this tradition in full operation, and they engaged with it. Roman period deposits continue at the major water sanctuaries. Bath, known to its inhabitants as Aquae Sulis, the waters of Sulis, was a sacred spring site before the Romans arrived and became a major Roman sanctuary after. The spring honoring a deity who was simultaneously the Celtic Sulis and the Roman Minerva, her identity synthesized rather than replaced. The site continued to receive offerings throughout the Roman period, and the sacred quality of the spring persisted into the Christian period and arguably into the present. Sulis Minerva is a useful example of what the Romans did with the sacred landscape they inherited. They did not generally try to erase it. They translated it. They gave Celtic deities Roman names or identified them with Roman equivalents. They built Roman-style temples at sites that were already sacred. They participated in local traditions while making them legible within a Roman framework. The result was a cultural palimpsest, a landscape in which Roman and pre-Roman sacred geographies overlaid each other, each visible through the other if you knew how to look. After the Romans left in the early 5th century of the Common Era, the sacred landscape did not revert to exactly what it had been before. It had been transformed by 4 centuries of Roman occupation, and the transformation was not entirely undone by the end of Roman administration. But the underlying structure persisted. The springs were still sacred. The hills were still significant. The ancient monuments were still present in the landscape and still commanded attention from whoever encountered them. The Anglo-Saxon settlers who arrived in Britain from the 5th century onward encountered the same challenge the Celts had faced centuries earlier. A landscape full of ancient structures they had not made and could not fully explain, and they responded in much the same way. They named the structures. They attached stories to them. They incorporated them into their own cosmological and mythological frameworks, and in doing so, they preserved the memory of their existence, even as they replaced the understanding of their origin. Stonehenge appears in the earliest Anglo-Saxon sources as a wonder of Britain, one of the remarkable things about this island. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, gave it an origin story involving Merlin and giants and stones brought from Ireland, a story that is clearly mythological, but that encodes certain truths. The stones did come from a considerable distance. The engineering did require capabilities that seemed superhuman to medieval observers, and the site was genuinely ancient in a way that commanded respect, even from people who had no direct connection to its builders. The landscape holds more secrets than most people realize. Beneath the fields and the suburban streets and the motorways and the sheep pastures, there are features that archaeologists are only beginning to map. LIDAR surveys of wooded areas have revealed hitherto unknown monument complexes hidden beneath tree canopy for centuries. Ground-penetrating radar at sites like Stonehenge has revealed features beneath the surface that change our understanding of how those landscapes were organized and used. Aerial photography continues to reveal crop marks and soil shadows that indicate buried structures across enormous areas of the countryside. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project, which used a combination of remote sensing technologies to survey the landscape around Stonehenge without excavation, revealed a landscape that was far more densely packed with archaeological features than anyone had previously understood. Dozens of previously unknown monuments, pit alignments, buried features of uncertain function. The visible monuments that tourists see represent a tiny fraction of what was actually built. The invisible landscape is larger and more complex than the visible one. This is true across Britain. What we see is the part that survived, the part that was stone, or that was buried in conditions that preserved it. The wooden monuments, the organic materials, the structures built in places that were later covered by towns or ploughed flat by agriculture, these are gone except as shadows. And the shadows, when we look for them, are everywhere. Every year the picture gets more complex. Every year the scale of what was built becomes clearer. Every year the sophistication of the people who built it becomes harder to dismiss. There is a school of thought in archaeoacoustics, the study of sound within ancient monuments, that adds another dimension to this picture. Researchers who have studied the acoustic properties of stone circles and passage tombs have found that many of them have unusual and apparently deliberate acoustic characteristics. Stonehenge, in its complete original form, would have created significant reverberation within its central space. The stones would have reflected sound in ways that created complex interference patterns, making sound inside the circle behave very differently from sound in the open air outside it. Voices and drums and other sounds produced inside would have taken on qualities they lacked outside. Rupert Till at the University of Huddersfield has studied the acoustic properties of Stonehenge using scale models and computer modeling, and his results suggest that the complete monument would have produced an echo pattern with specific characteristics that modern concert hall designers would recognize as intentional acoustic shaping. The space was designed to sound a certain way. Whatever was performed inside it, whether music or speech or some form of ritual vocalization, would have been heard in a context that was orally distinctive and powerful. Some passage tombs have even more pronounced acoustic properties. The main chamber at Newgrange has been found to have resonance frequencies in a range that affects human perception in very specific ways. Low frequencies in certain chambers create physical sensations, a feeling of vibration or pressure that can alter the experience of being in that space. Whether this was deliberately designed or whether it emerged from the construction methods and materials used is debated. But the effect is real, and it would have been noticeable to anyone using these spaces for extended ritual activities. If you combine the visual drama of the solstice alignment with the specific acoustic properties of the chamber space, and if you add the physical and psychological effects of extended darkness and isolation within a stone chamber, you get a sensory environment that is quite unlike anything experienced in ordinary daily life. And sensory environments, unlike ordinary daily life, have specific and well-documented effects on human consciousness. They can produce altered states, heightened perception, experiences of contact with something beyond the ordinary self. Were the builders of these monuments deliberately engineering altered states of consciousness in their ritual participants? This is a controversial suggestion, and it needs to be made carefully. But the evidence that the spaces were designed for something beyond simple astronomical observation, and that they had perceptible effects on the people inside them, is real. And if that is what was happening in these monuments, then the people who inherited them without the knowledge of how they worked, who stood inside them without the supporting context of the ritual traditions that had animated them, would have found them profoundly unsettling, would have found that something was still happening in these spaces that they could feel but not explain, would have understood that whatever power had created these places had not entirely departed from them, which is more or less what the stories say. The civilization that existed in Britain before the Celts, before the Romans, before anyone we name in the history books, was doing things that were astonishing by any standard. They were tracking the moon for thousands of years before they built their first monument. They were moving stones weighing dozens of tons across distances of hundreds of kilometers. They were engineering buildings whose astronomical alignments would hold to within fractions of a degree for 5,000 years. They were organizing communities at a regional scale, without writing and without metal, and without any of the things we normally associate with the ability to organize at scale. And they were doing all of this in a landscape that the people who came after them recognized as sacred, as powerful, as requiring ongoing attention and care and negotiation, not as the ruins of an incomprehensible past, as something alive. When you stand at Stonehenge at dawn on the winter solstice and the first light of the new sun enters the monument and falls on the altar stone at the center, you are standing in a relationship with people who lived 5,000 years ago. They built this for this moment. They built it for someone to stand in this light. The fact that you are there, that the light is there, that the moment is exactly what they calculated it would be, is their gift to every generation that followed them, including the Celts who wrapped them in mythology, including the Romans who marveled at them, including us, standing here now still trying to understand. Some things survive long enough to become permanent, long enough to outlast the language and the memory and the very bones of the people who created them, long enough to become simply part of the world, like a mountain or a river, old enough that their origin is forgotten, but their presence is undeniable. That is what the earliest builders of Britain achieved. Not immortality, because their bodies are dust and their names are lost and their language is silence. But something very close to it. The monuments remain. The alignments hold. And at the right moment, In the right light, something that is not quite memory and not quite imagination moves through the interior of the stones. The Celts felt it, the Romans felt it, we feel it. That feeling, that sense of contact with something older and larger than ourselves, is not nothing. It is the transmission of something real. A message sent in stone 5,000 years ago, still arriving. Consider what it means that we are still here, still making these pilgrimages, still gathering at these old stones, at the old significant moments. The winter solstice crowd at Stonehenge has grown year by year in recent decades. People come from across the world to stand inside the monument at dawn and watch the light do what the builders intended it to do. They come in all the varieties that modern human culture produces, with every different belief and background and relationship to the sacred and the historical. And yet, the moment works for all of them. The light comes through the gap in the stones and falls on the ground at the center, and everyone present feels something. What they feel may vary. What the feeling is rooted in is common to all of them. It is the recognition that something was understood here, a very long time ago, that is still true, that the earth moves around the sun on a predictable schedule, that the darkest moment is always followed by the return of the light, that the world is old beyond imagining and that humans have been part of it, paying attention to it, building relationships with it, for far longer than our histories acknowledge. The builders of Stonehenge knew that. They knew it well enough to build a monument that would demonstrate it, in light and stone, to everyone who came after them. They knew it well enough to engineer a gift across 5,000 years of change and loss and replacement and transformation, a gift that still works, that still arrives on schedule every winter solstice morning. Whatever else they were, whatever social structures they maintained, and whatever cosmological frameworks they operated within, they were people who thought in timescales that dwarf our own. People who built for their great-great-great-grandchildren's great-great-great-grandchildren. People for whom the relationship between a human community and its landscape was permanent enough to be worth encoding in the hardest materials available. That is not primitive. That is not the behavior of people who did not understand the world they lived in. That is the behavior of people who understood it so profoundly that they trusted their understanding enough to build it in stone and trust the stone, said Taimholm. There is a place in the Somerset levels of southwest England that most people drive past without knowing it exists. Not because it is hidden, but because the landscape is so flat and so green and so ordinary looking from a car window that nothing signals the depth of what lies beneath. The Somerset levels are low-lying marshland, reclaimed from bog and flood over centuries, now given over to dairy farming and the growing of willow for basket weaving. They are quiet and damp and not obviously remarkable. But beneath the surface of that quiet green landscape, preserved in anaerobic peat for thousands of years, are wooden trackways, planks and rails and poles of split timber laid down across the boggy ground to provide footing in what was, in the Neolithic period, an extensive wetland environment. Some of these trackways are among the oldest wooden structures known anywhere in the world. The Sweet Track, named after the peat cutter Ray Sweet, who discovered it in 1970, was built in the year 3806, before the Common Era. We know this date with extraordinary precision because the oak planks that form its walking surface were dendrochronologically dated, matched to the ring sequences of trees that grew at that specific time. The Sweet Track was built in a single winter, apparently to serve as a specific connection between two areas of higher ground across a stretch of marsh. It was maintained for use for approximately 10 years and then abandoned as the marsh changed. Less than a mile of wooden planking on a bog in Somerset, built for a decade and then given up. Along the trackway, in the peat alongside it, archaeologists have found objects. Polished stone axes, a wooden bowl, fragments of pottery, a jadeite axe head of exceptional quality, green and smooth and polished to a perfection that the flint axes of the period cannot match. That jadeite axe head came from the Alps, from quarries in what is now northern Italy, from which jadeite axes were traded across enormous distances during the Neolithic period. The person who dropped it beside the Sweet Track, or who placed it there deliberately, was carrying an object that had traveled perhaps 1,000 miles from its source. Why would you travel 1,000 miles to acquire an axe head made of a material that is no more practically effective than the locally available stone? Because the material itself carried meaning. Jadeite from Alpine sources was a prestige material, recognizable across a wide geographic area as coming from a specific origin, associated with specific qualities and possibly with specific powers. To own a jadeite axe was to signal participation in a network that extended far beyond your local landscape. It was, in a material culture that had no coinage and no writing, a kind of currency of identity. These are not the possessions of people stumbling around in the dark. These are the possessions of people embedded in sophisticated exchange networks, with a well-developed material semiotics, a system of meanings carried by objects that was understood across wide geographic areas. And they were building wooden trackways across bogs in Somerset and losing jadeite axes beside them while all of this was going on. The Somerset Levels trackway system extended over a considerable area and was in use over a period of several thousand years. Different trackways from different periods show different engineering approaches, from the simple, round wood poles of the earliest examples to the more sophisticated plank-on-rail construction of the Sweet Track and its contemporaries. There was development, there was learning from experience. There was the application of improved techniques to recurring problems. This is engineering culture, transmitted and improved across generations. What were the people of the Somerset Levels doing in the marsh that required these trackways? The wetland environment was productive, waterfowl in large numbers, fish in the rivers and rhines, reed for thatch and weaving, peat for fuel. The trackways may have facilitated access to these resources. But some researchers have suggested that the wetlands also had a sacred dimension, that the boundary between land and water was understood as a boundary between worlds, and that movement through the marsh was not purely economic, but also ritual. Objects deposited in the peat alongside the trackways support this reading. Deposits that look deliberate rather than accidental. Objects placed, not dropped. The landscape of the Somerset Levels in the Neolithic period was a liminal landscape, literally a world between worlds, between the firm ground of the hills and the open water of the flooded plain. And liminal landscapes, in almost every human culture that has developed a cosmology involving other realms, are understood as places where the boundary thins, where access to what lies on the other side of the ordinary world becomes possible, where the sacred is close. The people who built the Sweet Track and walked across it in 3,800 years before the Common Era were walking through a sacred landscape, and they were doing it in a structure of extraordinary practical sophistication. These things were not separate for them. The practical and the sacred were aspects of the same engagement with the world. Let us move now to a different kind of evidence, one that tends to get overlooked in favor of the dramatic physical monuments. The genetic record of what happened to the people who built those monuments is, in its own way, as dramatic as the monuments themselves. And it raises questions that are still being worked out. We have established that the beaker-associated population replacement around 4,400 years ago was dramatic and rapid. Within a few centuries, the genetic signal of the Neolithic monument builders largely disappears from the British population. But this raises an obvious question that the genetic data alone cannot answer. What happened? How does a population effectively disappear from an island in a few centuries? The honest answer is that we do not know. The genetic replacement is documented, but the mechanism is not. Several scenarios have been proposed. The most dramatic is violent conquest, a rapid military takeover in which the Beaker people arrived with superior weapons, including copper and early bronze, and overwhelmed communities that were numerically superior but technologically disadvantaged. There is some evidence for violence in the archaeological record of the period, though it is not overwhelming enough to make this the only possible interpretation. Another scenario involves disease. Incoming populations frequently carry pathogens to which they have acquired some immunity, but to which the existing population has none. The demographic consequences of disease introduction can be catastrophic and rapid, producing exactly the kind of population collapse that the genetic record suggests. without requiring any intentional violence. The Beaker people arriving from the continent may have carried diseases to which the Neolithic British population had no resistance, and the consequences may have been devastating long before any direct conflict occurred. A third possibility involves a more gradual social and economic displacement. If the Beaker people arrived with metal tools, metal weapons, and a social structure organized around individual prestige and hereditary hierarchy, they may have offered to the existing elites of Neolithic Britain a new model of social organization that was attractive enough to be adopted by those elites, transforming the social structure from within rather than replacing it through direct conquest. The genetic replacement then reflects not a violent takeover, but a change in who was socially dominant enough to reproduce successfully across generations. The truth may involve all three of these mechanisms operating simultaneously or in sequence. What we know is the result, not the process. But here is what is genuinely strange about the result. The monuments survived the people who built them, not just physically, in terms of their active use and their sacred significance. The new population adopted the sacred landscape of the people they replaced. They continued to use the sites. They added to them. They maintained them. This suggests not a total rupture, but a degree of continuity, possibly in the form of knowledge transmission from the survivors of the Neolithic population to the newcomers, or possibly through the monuments themselves, which communicated enough of their own purpose to continue being useful. There may also have been more biological continuity than the average genetic statistics suggest. The genetic replacement was dramatic, but it was not absolute. Small proportions of Neolithic ancestry persisted in the post-Beaker population, concentrated perhaps in specific regions or specific communities. The people who carried the most knowledge of the old sites, the specialists whose lives were organized around the maintenance of the astronomical and cosmological traditions, may have been precisely the people most likely to be absorbed into the new social order rather than displaced by it. Their knowledge made them valuable, and through them, something of what the original builders knew may have passed into the new tradition. This is speculation. The genetic record cannot tell us about the social trajectories of specific individuals or communities. But the pattern of monument continuation after the population replacement is clear, and it does require some explanation beyond mere pragmatism. Move forward another 1,000 years to the Bronze Age, and the landscape continues to evolve in ways that reflect persistent cosmological commitments, even as the specific forms change. The round barrows of the Bronze Age are a different form from the long barrows of the Neolithic, but they occupy the same kinds of prominent landscape positions, they mark the same kinds of significant ridgelines, and they continue to express the same underlying commitment to making the relationship between the living and the dead visible in the landscape. Bronze Age people were also doing things with the landscape that go beyond simple burial commemoration. The field systems of the late Bronze Age, that are visible as low earthworks on the chalk downs, represent the first systematic organization of agricultural land in Britain, a transformation of the landscape from something defined primarily by monument and sacred geography into something also defined by productive economic geography. This is not a rejection of the earlier sacred landscape. It is its incorporation into a more complex set of land uses. The boundaries between the field systems sometimes appear to respect or acknowledge the pre-existing monument landscape. Tracks align to prominent features. Fields cluster around older sacred sites in ways that suggest the agricultural organization was designed in relationship to an existing spatial framework rather than imposed on a blank slate. The two landscapes, the sacred and the productive, were being managed as parts of a single coherent geography. What this tells us about the social organization of late Bronze Age Britain is significant. Coordinating field systems across a wide area, maintaining the boundaries between different communities' territories, managing the relationship between agricultural land and common grazing land. All of this requires institutions capable of making and enforcing decisions at a scale above the individual household or even the individual village. It requires something like governance, even in the absence of writing or formal political structures in any form we would recognize. The Bronze Age communities of Britain were governing themselves, managing their collective resources, maintaining their landscape, participating in long-distance exchange networks, and doing all of this without any of the administrative technologies that modern states regard as essential. They were doing it through institutions that left no written record, through traditions maintained in memory and performance, through the accumulated weight of accumulated practice, stretching back into a past that was already ancient to them. What do we know about the religious practices of the Bronze Age communities specifically? The material evidence is suggestive, if not conclusive. The continued deposition of objects in water bodies, the maintenance of sacred landscape features, the elaborate treatment of the dead with specific grave goods and specific body orientations. All of this speaks to a cosmological framework in which the relationship between the living world and other realms was practically important and regularly attended to. The cairns and stone settings of the upland landscapes of the Bronze Age show a particular attention to the astronomical. Not always as precise as the major Neolithic monuments, but reflecting the same fundamental interest in the relationship between earthly locations and celestial events. Recumbent stone circles continue to be built in Aberdeenshire throughout the Bronze Age. Stone rows continue to be added to the Dartmoor system. New stone circles are erected in new locations, some of them with clear astronomical orientations, others apparently responding to local topographic features that have their own sacred significance. The Bronze Age people were inheriting a tradition and modifying it. They were not simply carrying on what the Neolithic builders had done. They were doing something of their own, informed by but not identical to the earlier tradition. This is what living traditions do. They adapt, they evolve, they respond to changing conditions and changing cosmological frameworks while maintaining continuity with what came before. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age in Britain, which is conventionally dated to around 800 years before the Common Era, was not a sudden transformation. It was a gradual process of change in which iron technology, more widely available and in many ways superior to bronze for everyday tools and weapons, spread across Britain over several centuries, while much else remained continuous. The social structures, the sacred landscape, the basic patterns of settlement and land use, these things changed more slowly than the material culture and maintained significant continuities across the technological transition. The Iron Age communities who built the great hill forts and maintained the Druidic tradition were the inheritors of a very long cultural tradition, rooted in the landscapes and practices of the Neolithic and Bronze Age. They may not have been able to read those traditions in any explicit sense, may not have had stories that accurately identified the builders of Stonehenge or the meaning of the Cursus monuments. But they lived in a landscape that those builders had organized and in which the cosmological priorities of the building tradition were physically encoded in stone and earth. The landscape itself was a kind of teaching. The persistence of sacred geography across cultural transitions is one of the most striking features of the British evidence. Springs that were sacred in the Neolithic continued to be sacred in the Bronze Age, and in the Iron Age, and in the Roman period, and in the medieval Christian period. Hills that were significant in the Bronze Age continued to be significant to Iron Age communities. The sacred map of Britain is extraordinarily stable across an enormous span of time, and the monuments that mark its significant points are the reason for that stability. When the first Celtic languages arrived in Britain, they arrived into a landscape that was already thick with meaning, already organized by thousands of years of accumulated sacred geography, already populated with the remains of a civilization that had understood something about the relationship between land and sky and community that every subsequent culture on the island has been trying to recover or reinvent. The Celts, who were terrified of the cedar, who told stories about the Tuatha De Danann living beneath the ancient mounds, who built their own sacred geographies in relationship to, and sometimes on top of the earlier ones, were not being superstitious. They were responding rationally to an encounter with something genuinely extraordinary, something that their own tradition could not account for, something that demonstrated, in stone and alignment and sacred spring, that the people who had been here before them had known things that they did not. And in that recognition, that careful, story-wrapped, ritually managed recognition, they preserved something essential. the memory that this landscape had depth, that the ground beneath their feet held echoes of something earlier and something profound, that the mounds and the circles and the alignments were not random features of the terrain, but the deliberate expressions of an intelligence that had engaged with this land and this sky and this specific set of relationships between them for longer than any story could reach. That memory, passed on in myth and in practice, and in the stories told around fires about the powers that lived in the old places, kept something alive across the centuries. It kept the sacred landscape in active relationship with the communities who lived in it. It prevented the monuments from becoming simply ruins. It ensured that when the Romans arrived and then departed, when the Anglo-Saxons came and made themselves at home, when the Normans transformed the political structure of the island, through all of those transformations, the ancient places retained their quality of mattering, their quality of being somewhere rather than nowhere. That quality is still there. It is what draws people to Stonehenge and to Avebury and to the long barrows on the chalk downs and to the standing stones on the Orkney hilltops. It is what makes those places feel different from the landscape around them, feel as if something is present that is not present in ordinary fields and roads and towns. Whether that feeling has a supernatural explanation or purely a naturalistic one, it is real. People feel it consistently and across widely different cultural and religious backgrounds. What creates it? Partly, it is simply age. Things that are old create a particular kind of awareness in humans. We recognize grey age and respond to it. Partly, it is scale. These are large structures, large enough to impress anyone regardless of their prior knowledge of them. Partly, it is the evidence of human investment. We recognize that these places required enormous effort to create, and we instinctively understand that effort as meaning. But partly, also it is the astronomical alignments, the fact that these structures still work, that the light still enters Newgrange on the winter solstice morning, that the summer solstice sun still rises over the heelstone at Stonehenge, that the major standstill moon still skims the hills at Callanish. These are not coincidences or approximations. They are precise. They work exactly as intended. And when they work, when you stand in a 5,000-year-old monument and watch the light do exactly what the builders intended it to do, something happens that is not easily explained away. You are connected to something. Across 5,000 years of human change and loss and transformation, something reaches you. An act of will and knowledge and vision from people long dead, arriving in the present as planned. It is, in the most literal sense, a message, and you receive it. That is what the builders of prehistoric Britain gave to every generation that would follow them. Not a text that could be translated and lost. Not a tradition that could be forgotten or corrupted. A physical demonstration, built in the hardest available materials, aligned to phenomena that do not change. A message that does not depend on language or on cultural continuity to arrive. It depends only on the physical relationship between the earth and the sun and the moon, which the builders correctly understood to be permanent. In building that, they achieved something that no civilization with writing has achieved. They created a communication that works across any cultural gap. That speaks to anyone who stands in the right place at the right moment. That says simply and irrefutably, we were here. We understood this. We wanted you to know. And we do know. We stand in their monuments and we feel their knowledge arriving. We do not know their names or their language or their stories. We do not know the specific cosmological framework that gave these alignments their meaning for them. But we know the alignment. We know the light. We know the precision and the care and the intention encoded in the stone. And that is extraordinary. It is extraordinary that it was done. And it is extraordinary that it still works. And it is most extraordinary of all that we are still here, still making the journey to these old places, still standing in the light at the solstice morning, still feeling something that does not have a simple name. The people who built Britain's oldest monuments were not primitive. They were not terrified of the world they lived in. They were not stumbling through the dark. They were paying attention. They were paying extraordinary, sustained, multi-generational attention to the world around them and to the sky above them. and they were recording what they learned in the most permanent way available to them. They built Britain, not the Britain of kingdoms and parliaments and motorways and cities, but the Britain of sacred hills and aligned stones and spring offerings and long-kept traditions that outlasted every invader and every transformation. The Britain that still exists underneath the modern surface, detectable if you know how to look, still present in the landscape for anyone patient enough to find it. The Celts, who were frightened of the Shida, were frightened of exactly this: the presence of something older and wiser and more deeply rooted in the landscape than they were. The presence of an intelligence that had known this island so well and for so long that it had become part of the island, that it persisted in stone and alignment and sacred water, and the stories people told about the old places long after the people who had created it were gone. That presence is still there, still in the stones, still in the alignment of the solstice light, still in the spring waters and the hill shapes and the places where the landscape seems to hold more than it should. The civilization that built Britain is the oldest thing about Britain, and it is still here. If this slowed journey through the ancient layers of this island has helped CA, let us spend time with the evidence from a different angle. Because so far we have talked about the monuments and the astronomical knowledge and the population genetics and the mythology. But there is another set of evidence that tends to get less attention, and that is the evidence for the actual daily lives of the people who built these monuments. Who were they? Not cosmologically, not genetically, but practically. What did they eat? How did they live? What were the rhythms of their days? The answer, as it emerges from decades of careful archaeological work, is more interesting than most people expect. The Neolithic people of Britain were not exclusively farmers in the modern sense. They were doing something more complicated and more interesting, a kind of managed interaction with the landscape that included farming but was not defined by it. They kept cattle, and the cattle evidence is particularly revealing. Isotope analysis of cattle bones from major monument sites like Dorrington Walls and the Ness of Brodgar shows that the animals came from far away, not the local landscape, in some cases from hundreds of miles away. These animals were driven across Britain over long periods and slaughtered at specific locations in what appear to have been seasonal feasting events. The pattern suggests a pastoral economy managed at a regional scale, with cattle serving as a form of movable wealth and social obligation, as well as a food source. This is not the peasant farming of popular imagination. This is something closer to a pastoral aristocracy, communities whose wealth and social relationships were organized around cattle in ways that parallel the pastoral elite traditions of many African and Asian societies. Cattle were prestige animals. They were gifts. They were debts. They were the material form of social relationships, and the places where they were slaughtered in large numbers, the great henge monuments, were not just religious centers in an abstract sense. They were the locations where the social bonds between communities were renewed and renegotiated through the sharing of meat and the performance of ceremony. Think of them as the combination of a stock market, a law court, a cathedral, and a festival ground. The sacred and the economic were not separate. This helps explain the enormous investment in monument building. If Stonehenge and Avebury and the other great henge monuments were the locations where the social fabric of the entire regional system was maintained, then building them impressively and maintaining them carefully was not optional. These were the infrastructure of civilization itself, not in the metaphorical sense, but in the literal sense. They were the places where the agreements that held society together were made and renewed. The food evidence from these sites also tells us about the range of the network. Pig's teeth isotopes from Dorrington Walls, as noted earlier, show animals from Scotland and Wales and the far southwest, animals that took weeks or months to drive to their destination. Who drove them? And why would a community from Scotland drive their pigs to Wiltshire for a feast? The answer must involve obligations of some kind, relationships that required attendance and contribution, a system of mutual commitment expressed in the form of food brought from far away to a central shared location. We tend to think of feasting as a byproduct of social connection, Food shared after the real business is done. But in many societies, the feast is the business. The act of sharing food is the act of making and renewing social bonds. And the scale of the feast, the quantity and quality of what is shared, is a direct measure of the strength of those bonds and the status of the participants. To bring pigs from Scotland to Wiltshire for a midwinter feast at Durrington Walls was not incidental. It was the point. Which means that the monument at Stonehenge nearby, built to align with the midsummer sunrise while the great wooden circles at Durrington Walls aligned with the winter sunrise, was the architectural expression of a social system that organised the population of Britain around two great seasonal moments: midsummer and midwinter, the longest day and the shortest day, the extremes of the solar year around which everything else was organised. This is sophisticated calendrical thinking embedded in the landscape on a scale that can be seen from miles away. It is the public expression of a private understanding. The community that could build Stonehenge and Durrington Walls and align them to the solar year was a community that wanted the year's structure to be visible, to be undeniable, to be part of the shared environment in which everyone lived. The landscape itself was a calendar. You did not need a specialist to tell you what time of year it was. The shadows of the monuments told you. There is another set of monuments in Britain that is almost never discussed in popular accounts, but that deserves attention here. The long-distance linear monuments, the earthen ridgeways and the early road systems that connected the major monument complexes to each other and to the wider landscape. Some of these routes are still in use today. The Ridgeway in southern England, which runs along the chalk escarpment of the North Wessex Downs for about 87 miles, is thought to be one of the oldest roads in Britain, predating the Roman road network by thousands of years. It passes near or through multiple major prehistoric sites, including Avebury and Wayland's Smithy and the Uffington Whitehorse. The Ridgeway was not a chance development, a path worn into the hillside by generations of walkers, choosing the same route because the chalk was firm and the view was good. It was a deliberate infrastructure element in a planned landscape, maintained and managed by the communities that used it. It was the spine of a sacred geography, connecting the significant places and defining the routes along which the seasonal movements and the ritual journeys of the community were organized. Walking the Ridgeway today, even in its current form, gives you a sense of what it might have meant to walk it in the Neolithic. The chalk down is open to the sky in all directions. The views are enormous. On a clear day, you can see for 30 miles or more. And the significant sites, the monument complexes, and the sacred heights are visible from the track at intervals that feel almost choreographed, as if the route was designed to present them in sequence, to build a narrative of the landscape as you moved through it. Maybe it was. The deliberate organization of approach routes to sacred sites is a feature of religious architecture across many cultures and many periods. The avenue at Avebury, the long stone-lined processional approach that runs for almost 2 miles from the henge to the monument complex called the Sanctuary on Overton Hill, is a clear example of this principle applied at landscape scale. You did not just arrive at Avebury, you processed to it. And the processing was part of the experience, part of the transformation from ordinary traveller to ritual participant. What happened to you as you walked the avenue? The avenue was lined with standing stones, alternating between tall, slim stones and shorter, wider ones, in a pattern that some researchers have interpreted as representing a binary categorization, perhaps male and female, perhaps life and death, perhaps something else entirely. Whatever the specific meaning, the alternation was deliberate. You walked between stones that were different from each other in a systematic way, and whatever that difference meant, it was present to your awareness throughout the approach. Then you entered the henge enclosure, crossing the enormous ditch and bank that marked the boundary between ordinary and sacred space. And the transition would have been perceptible as a change in the soundscape as well as in the visual environment. Inside the high banks of the henge, the sounds of the landscape outside would have been muffled. The great stones of the outer circle would have further shaped the acoustic environment. You would have been in a different place, not just symbolically, but sensorially. This is sophisticated environmental design. the kind of design that modern architects study and struggle to replicate, creating spaces that feel different from surrounding spaces through the manipulation of visual fields and acoustic environments and the physical experience of movement through them. The Neolithic builders of Avebury were doing this 4,500 years ago in chalk and stone and earth. The fact that this sophistication is not more widely recognized is itself interesting. There is a persistent tendency in popular accounts of prehistoric Britain to acknowledge the impressiveness of the monuments while somehow denying the sophistication of the people who built them. To say, yes, Stonehenge is extraordinary, and then to speak of its builders as if they were lucky primitives who somehow stumbled onto something great without quite understanding what they were doing. This does not make sense. You cannot build something that precise without understanding what you are doing. The precision is the evidence of the understanding. Part of the problem may be the absence of writing. We are so thoroughly trained to associate literacy with intelligence that the absence of written records reads, at some level, as an absence of complex thought. But writing is a technology, not a measure of intelligence. It is a tool for certain kinds of record keeping and communication, and its absence does not imply the absence of the kinds of thinking that writing facilitates. The builders of Stonehenge were thinking about astronomy and geometry, and logistics and social organization in ways that are evidenced by the monuments themselves. The absence of a written record of that thinking does not mean the thinking did not happen. Another part of the problem is that the default image of prehistoric people in the popular imagination is still shaped by 19th century ideas about cultural evolution, the idea that human societies progress linearly from simple to complex, from primitive to civilized, and that any society without writing and metal and cities is therefore lower on that ladder than any society that has those things. This framework is deeply embedded in how we teach history, and it actively prevents us from seeing the prehistoric record clearly. The people who built Stonehenge did not need us to validate their sophistication. The monument validates it. The alignment holds after 5,000 years. The engineering works. The astronomical knowledge it encodes is correct. These are not the products of lucky accidents or of simple minds occasionally getting things right. They are the products of sustained, rigorous, multi-generational intellectual effort directed at understanding the world and encoding that understanding in permanent physical form. We owe it to them to see that clearly, to acknowledge what they achieved on its own terms, rather than measuring it against technologies and knowledge systems that came later. To understand that what was built in Britain between roughly 5,000 and 2,000 years before the Common Era represents one of the great achievements of human civilization. However, that civilization defined itself, and however it organized itself, and whatever it believed. The hill, known as Glastonbury Tor in Somerset, rises dramatically from the flat levels surrounding it to a height of roughly 158 meters. It is a natural hill, the resistant core of a geological formation that was left standing when the surrounding softer rock eroded away over millions of years. But it does not look entirely natural, and the reason it does not look entirely natural is because of the terracing. The sides of the tor are cut with a series of regular terraces that spiral around the hill in a pattern that has no obvious geological explanation. The terraces are too regular, too consistent in their dimensions, to be the product of natural erosion or of casual grazing by animals over centuries. Who made the Glastonbury Tor terraces? Nobody knows for certain. They have been interpreted as the remains of a three-dimensional spiral labyrinth, a path cut into the hillside that would have taken many circuits to ascend, possibly used for ritual processions of the kind that archaeological evidence suggests were common in the megalithic period. They have also been interpreted as agricultural terraces, which is a possible but less convincing explanation, given their spiral rather than horizontal form. And they have been dismissed as natural features, though the regularity is difficult to explain on purely natural grounds. What is certain is that Glastonbury Tor was a significant sacred site throughout the prehistoric and early medieval period. Objects from the Bronze Age and the Iron Age have been found on and around it. In the Christian period, it became associated with the abbey at its foot, and then with Arthurian legend, and then with a kind of generalized spirituality that draws visitors from around the world to this day. Whether or not any specific claims about its prehistory are correct, the Tor has clearly functioned as a sacred site continuously for thousands of years. It is one of a type of site that appears repeatedly in the sacred geography of Britain, a prominent natural feature that was recognized as significant and that received ongoing ritual attention across many cultural transitions. The natural and the artificial, the given landscape and the humanly modified landscape, combined in ways that made the significance of the place self-evident to anyone who came to it. The ancient relationship between British communities and their water sources goes deeper than the votive deposition tradition, important as that tradition is. The evidence from certain spring and well sites suggests a continuity of sacred use that may extend back to the Mesolithic, to the hunter-gatherer communities who inhabited Britain before the arrival of farming. Springs that emerge from the ground in specific geological formations, particularly where different rock types create boundaries that bring water to the surface, are associated with ritual deposits and sacred practices across an enormous span of time. The Holy Well tradition of Celtic Christianity, which is associated primarily with Ireland and with the Celtic-speaking regions of Britain, is usually discussed as a Christian phenomenon with pre-Christian roots. But those pre-Christian roots may go back much further than the Celtic Iron Age. The specific springs that became holy wells in the early Christian period were, in many cases, already sacred before any Celtic presence in Britain. They were sacred to the Neolithic communities, to the Bronze Age communities, to the Iron Age Celts, to the Romano-British population, and eventually to Christian communities. Each layer of significance building on what came before. The persistence of the sacred water landscape across all of these cultural transitions is one of the strongest arguments for a genuine underlying cosmological geography, a recognition of specific places as powerful that transcends any specific cultural interpretation of that power. Different communities explained the power in different terms, but the power itself, the sense that these places were different from the surrounding landscape, that they required special attention and special treatment, was recognized consistently across thousands of years. And perhaps that is the key insight that brings this whole story together. The civilization that existed in Britain before the Celts and before the Romans left behind not just monuments, but a cosmological geography, a reading of the landscape as differentiated, as having specific places of power and specific routes between them and specific times at which access to those places was particularly meaningful. And that geography, encoded in stone and in alignment and in the long-term memory of springs and hills and rivers, proved more durable than any specific cultural interpretation of it. The Celts came with their own cosmological framework, and they overlaid it on the existing geography. The Romans came and overlaid it again. The Christians came and overlaid it yet again. Each layer changed the interpretation while largely maintaining the underlying geography. The sacred places remained sacred. The routes between them remained significant. The seasonal timing of the great astronomical events remained the hinge points around which ritual life was organized. What the earliest builders of Britain understood was that certain relationships between earth and sky and water were permanent, that the winter solstice would always be the winter solstice, that the spring at this specific location would always emerge from the ground, that this specific ridgeline would always command this specific view of the horizon, where the midsummer sun rose. These things would not change, and by building in permanent materials and aligning to permanent phenomena, they created a system of meaning that was designed to survive beyond any specific cultural context. It did survive. It survived for 5,000 years, and it is surviving still. The monuments are there. The alignments hold. The springs still flow. And the people who come to these places, from every cultural background and every spiritual tradition and every degree of familiarity with the archaeological evidence, consistently feel something there that they do not feel elsewhere. Something that does not have a simple name, something that connects them to a past that is too old for any living memory to reach. That is what the people who built these places intended, or something close to it. They built for permanence. They built to be felt. They built to demonstrate in physical and astronomical fact that there was something here worth acknowledging, that this landscape was worth this investment, that the relationship between this particular piece of earth and this particular configuration of sky was significant enough to encode in stone and maintain across centuries. And they were right. It was. It is. The civilization that terrified the Celts was not terrifying because it was violent or because it was powerful in the military sense. It was terrifying because it was old, because its remains demonstrated a depth of knowledge and a depth of commitment to this landscape that the Celts, newcomers by comparison, could not match and could not fully understand. Because the mounds were too perfect, and the alignments too precise, and the springs too persistently sacred for any explanation that did not involve something more than ordinary human effort. The Celts were not wrong to be awed. The monuments are awesome. The astronomical knowledge is genuinely extraordinary. The social organization required to build on this scale, without metal and without writing and without any of the administrative technologies we associate with civilization, is something we still do not fully understand. What we do understand is the result, the landscape of Britain. Still organized, underneath all its historical layers, according to a cosmological geography laid out by people whose names we do not know, whose language we cannot recover, and whose buildings have been standing for 5,000 years. That is their legacy. It is still here, and it is still arriving. If these stories of ancient Britain have helped your mind slow and your body relax, then the old something that rarely gets discussed in accounts of prehistoric Britain is the evidence for trade with the wider world. Trade that went far beyond what we usually imagine when we think about Neolithic and Bronze Age communities. The objects that turn up in British archaeological contexts during this period tell a story of connections that are genuinely surprising in their geographic range. Amber from the Baltic coast, amber that could only have come from the shores of what is now Denmark and Sweden, has been found in burial contexts from Bronze Age Britain. Not in small quantities. In substantial deposits, enough amber to imply a regular and significant trade relationship, not a single lucky acquisition. The amber travelled, presumably in stages through a network of intermediary exchanges, from the shores of the Baltic to Britain. The people who received it in Britain valued it enough to place it in graves with the dead, to include it among the objects that were meant to accompany a person into whatever came next. Faience beads, made of a ceramic material that is essentially a precursor to glass, appear in Bronze Age Britain in forms that are almost identical to faience objects from the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Egypt of the New Kingdom, and from the cultures of the Near East. Whether these specific objects were directly traded from the Mediterranean, or whether the technology was transmitted through chains of exchange that moved knowledge and technique rather than finished goods, is still debated. But either way, the connection to the Mediterranean world is real. The Bronze Age of Britain was not isolated. It was part of a larger world. The tin that made British bronze came primarily from Cornwall and from Devon, and British tin was traded to the continent and possibly beyond throughout the Bronze Age. Classical sources from the first millennium before the Common Era mention the Tin Islands, the Cassiterides, as a source of tin that was traded through Gaul to the Mediterranean. The Cassiterides are generally identified with Cornwall and with the Scilly Isles. If that identification is correct, then the tin-producing communities of southwest Britain were embedded in long-distance trade networks that eventually connected them to the Mediterranean world before the Romans arrived, before the Greeks arrived, before any formal contact between Britain and the classical world. What does it mean for a community to be embedded in such a network? It means that people from that community were encountering strangers. Regularly, people who came from far away and spoke different languages and had different customs and were looking to acquire specific things. It means that the community had to develop ways of managing those encounters, ways of establishing trust and communicating across language barriers and setting terms that both parties would honor. It means that there were specialists in that community who knew the world beyond the local landscape, who had traveled or who had regular contact with people who had traveled, who had the social skills to navigate relationships with strangers. This is, again, not what we usually imagine when we think about prehistoric Britain, but it is what the evidence suggests. A world of active connections, of goods and ideas and people moving across significant distances, of communities that were simultaneously deeply rooted in their local landscape and actively engaged with a wider world. The connectivity of the Bronze Age world becomes even clearer when you look at the distribution of specific object types. The dirk, a long narrow bronze dagger that appears in the Middle Bronze Age, exists in forms that are essentially identical across a huge geographic range, from Ireland to Denmark to Central Europe. These are not similar objects. They are the same objects, produced to the same design specifications, using the same techniques. The design travelled, the technique travelled, which means the people who knew the design and the technique travelled, or the knowledge was transmitted through networks of communication dense enough to maintain design consistency across enormous distances. This is the Bronze Age equivalent of a standardized product. Someone, or some network of people, decided that a dirk should look a certain way and be made a certain way, and that decision was accepted and implemented across a geographic range that spans several modern countries. That is a level of cultural coordination that requires ongoing communication, ongoing relationships, ongoing contact between communities that are not near each other. The people of Bronze Age Britain were participating in all of this. They were not isolated on an island at the edge of the world. They were members of a wider civilization that happened to express itself most dramatically, in Britain's case, through the megalithic landscape and the astronomical tradition. But they were also trading and communicating and receiving and transmitting ideas and objects that connected them to the wider world. The hill forts of the Iron Age, when you understand them in this context, make more sense as what they were. Not just defensive structures for communities cowering in fear of their neighbors, but centers of production and exchange in a complex regional economy, places where goods were made and stored and traded, where social relationships were negotiated and maintained, where the institutions of regional society were housed and expressed. The defensive element was real and important, because competition between communities was real and sometimes violent. But defense was not the only function, and probably not the primary function for most of the hill forts most of the time. Danebury, as mentioned, shows evidence of systematic grain storage that implies administration at a community level. It also shows evidence of significant metalworking, not just the repair of tools, but the production of new objects in quantity, suggesting craft specialization and possibly production for trade, rather than just for local use. The material connections between Danebury and other hill forts in the region, and between the hill fort region and the continent, suggest an economic network of considerable sophistication. The currency bars that appear in Iron Age Britain, strips of iron of standardized weight and form, are sometimes called the first British currency. They are traded across wide areas in ways that imply a common understanding of their value, a shared system of exchange that transcends any single community. This is not barter in the simple sense. This is something approaching a monetary economy, or at least a commodity-based exchange system in which standardized units of specific materials function as a medium of exchange. All of this predates the Romans. It predates Julius Caesar's account of Britain and the Roman occupation and all of the things we usually associate with the introduction of civilization to this island. It was already here. The Romans brought writing and direct integration into the Mediterranean economic world and a specific form of urban life. But the complexity of the social and economic organization they found when they arrived was not their creation. It was the product of thousands of years of development, built on foundations laid by the people who built Stonehenge and Avebury and Callanish. The layers go deep in Britain, deeper than almost anywhere else in the world, with comparable monument density. And understanding the depth is important, not just as an academic exercise, but as a way of understanding what this landscape is, and what it means, and why people have been coming to its old places for 10,000 years. There is a particular quality to very old sacred places, a quality that is different from the quality of places that are merely impressive or historically significant. Stonehenge is impressive. It is also historically significant. But it is something else as well, something that the people who come to it consistently report, and that the people who study it consistently struggle to account for in purely historical or archaeological terms. It has depth, it has presence. It feels as if something is there that is not immediately explained by the stones and the ditches and the earthworks. Maybe that presence is purely psychological, the product of knowing that this place is old and that it has been sacred to countless people, and that the light does something extraordinary here at the right moment. Maybe the feeling is generated entirely within the person who feels it, shaped by expectation and by the weight of accumulated cultural significance. If so, then the monument works by causing people to feel something, which is precisely what a sacred site is supposed to do, and the mechanism does not diminish the effect. Or maybe there is something else. Something about the specific configuration of this place and the way it interacts with the specific astronomical phenomena it was designed to frame. Something about the acoustic properties of the stone arrangement and the way sound behaves inside it. Something about the relationship between the monument and the landscape around it, and the specific qualities of the light at this latitude, at these seasonal moments. These are not mystical claims. They are empirical observations waiting for better investigation. The acoustic properties of stone circles are measurable and are being measured. The effects of specific light conditions and spatial configurations on human perception and consciousness are measurable and are being studied. The relationship between specific landscape features and the astronomical phenomena they frame or exclude or channel is measurable and has been studied in considerable detail. What those investigations have consistently found is that the monuments were designed with great care for effects that were perceptible to the people inside them. Not supernatural effects. Natural ones, the specific sound of the space, the specific quality of the light at the aligned moments, the specific experience of entering through a narrow passage into a chamber that frames a view of the sky. These are engineered experiences, and the engineering is sophisticated. The people who created those experiences were paying attention. They were paying the kind of sustained, careful, rigorous attention to the physical world that we associate with science, even though they did not have anything we would recognize as scientific institutions. They were observing, recording, testing, refining, building on what previous generations had discovered. And the results of that process are the monuments that still stand. 5,000 years after they were built, those monuments are still teaching us things, still prompting new questions, still revealing new details as our investigative technologies improve. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project, the LiDAR surveys of woodland areas, the ground-penetrating radar surveys of the monument fields, all of these have, in the past decade, revealed features and connections that were unknown before. The monuments are not fully understood. We are still learning from them. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing of all, that things built by people, without writing, without metal, without any technology we would recognize as sophisticated, in a period so remote that it predates the oldest known writing by several thousand years, those things are still generating new knowledge 5 millennia later, still telling us things about the people who built them and the world they inhabited that we did not know before. The civilization of prehistoric Britain is not a lost civilization in the tragic sense of that phrase. Not Atlantis, not something that disappeared without leaving anything behind. It left behind an extraordinary amount. The monuments, the landscape, the genetic legacy in the population, the astronomical knowledge encoded in stone, the sacred geography that persists beneath every subsequent layer of British culture. It is all there. It is all findable. We are finding it. What was lost is the interpretation, the specific framework of meaning within which these achievements made sense to the people who made them, the cosmology that made the winter solstice, sunrise at Stonehenge, the most important moment of the year, the theology that explained why deposits in rivers were an effective way of communicating with whatever lay on the other side of the water, the social philosophy that made collective investment in enormous monuments a more rational use of community labor than individual accumulation of resources. We cannot recover those frameworks directly, but we can study the monuments and the landscapes and the patterns of use and the astronomical alignments and the comparative evidence from other cultures and other periods, and we can build an increasingly detailed and increasingly plausible picture of what the frameworks might have been. Not certainty, but understanding. Provisional, partial, open to revision understanding, and that understanding matters. It matters because these were human beings, because the drive that led them to drag bluestones from Wales to Wiltshire and align them to the solstice sunrise is the same drive that leads us to push telescopes into orbit and align them to the farthest reaches of the cosmos. The desire to understand the world, the desire to build something that demonstrates understanding, the desire to leave a mark that says we were here, and we knew this. We thought this was important. We wanted you to know. That desire is not prehistoric. It is not particularly Celtic or Roman or modern. It is human. It has been human for as long as there have been humans paying attention to the sky and to the earth and to the relationship between them. And Britain, for reasons that are partly geological and partly geographical and partly simply the contingent outcome of specific historical processes, became a place where that desire expressed itself in monuments that have outlasted every cultural transformation of the island. The civilization that was there before the Romans was there before the Celts too. And before that, for thousands of years, the people who built the landscape that the Celts found and feared. They are all part of the same long story. The story of humans in this particular place, paying attention to this particular sky and this particular earth and trying to make sense of what they found. That story is not finished. We are still paying attention, still building, still trying to understand, still making the pilgrimages to the old places where the alignments hold and the light comes through and the question of what it all means remains as open as it was 5,000 years ago when someone stood in front of the stones they had moved from Wales to Wiltshire and watched the sun rise over the heelstone for the first time and knew that it was right. It is still right. The light still comes. The solstice still turns. And the old stones are still there, still patient, still waiting for anyone willing to stand in the right place at the right moment and receive what was built for them across 5,000 years of silence. Rest now. You have been to very old places tonight. Let the weight of AI. There is a question that tends to linger at the edges of all discussions of prehistoric Britain, one that is rarely asked directly, but that shapes the assumptions of almost every account. The question is this: what were the people of Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain actually like? Not what did they build, not what did they eat, not how did they organize their society, but who were they in the way that we usually mean when we ask that about other people? Were they curious or cautious, optimistic or fearful? Did they have a sense of humor? Did they argue? Did they love particular people and miss them when they were gone? The honest answer is that we do not know, and cannot know in any direct way. They left no texts, no letters, no poems, no histories, no stories that have come down to us through the kind of textual transmission that preserves the voices of people from later periods. What we have is their material culture and their monuments, and from those things we can make some inferences. One inference is that they were patient. The scale of commitment required to build and maintain the megalithic landscape over periods of thousands of years implies a quality of patience, of willingness to work toward goals, whose completion would not be seen in a single lifetime. That is not universal among humans or human cultures. Not every culture chooses to build in stone. Not every culture invests in permanent structures of the kind that these people built. The choice to do so implies a particular relationship to time, a sense that the future matters, that what you build now will be experienced by people who are not yet born, and that this matters enough to shape your decisions about how to spend your community's labor. We also know, from the care taken in the construction of the monuments, that these were people who cared about quality. The orthostats at Stonehenge are not crudely shaped. They are dressed, worked with stone tools to achieve a surface and a form that is more refined than strictly necessary for structural purposes. Someone cared how they looked. Someone wanted them to be, in some sense, beautiful as well as functional. That is an aesthetic sensibility, a valuing of appearance for its own sake that is not necessary for survival, but that humans seem to develop almost universally. The carved decorations on the passage, tomb orthostats at Newgrange and at other Irish and British tomb sites are not structural elements. They do not make the stones stronger or more water resistant or easier to work with. They are there because someone wanted them there, because the act of carving the spirals and the chevrons and the lozenges on the stones was meaningful to the people who did it, and because the sight of those carvings was meaningful to the people who subsequently entered the chambers. What did the carvings mean? We cannot say with certainty, but we can observe that they are not random marks. They are precise, executed with skill and care, and they follow conventions that are consistent enough across multiple sites over a considerable geographic range to suggest that they belong to a shared symbolic tradition. Whatever specific meanings the individual motifs carried, the tradition of which they were part was broadly understood by the communities that produced and used these monuments. This tells us something about the intellectual and social environment of Neolithic Britain. It was not a world in which every community developed its own completely idiosyncratic system of symbols. It was a world in which symbolic traditions were shared across communities, maintained through contact and communication, and stable enough to persist for centuries with recognizable continuity. This is not a primitive world. This is a world with something that functions like culture, in the broad sense, a shared set of meanings and practices that extends beyond any single community. The evidence for large-scale feasting at the major monument sites is also revealing. Feasts require more than food. They require the social knowledge of how to organize them. Who sits where, in what order things are done, what protocols govern the conduct of the event, what obligations are created and discharged by participation. These are complex social rules that have to be maintained and transmitted and applied consistently, enough to make the events function. A feast that nobody knows the rules of is not a feast. It is a gathering. The distinction matters. That the feasts at places like Dorrington Walls were organized events with social protocols is strongly suggested by the pattern of deposits. The specific ways that remains were disposed of after the feasting, which are too consistent to be random. Someone was managing the event. Someone was making sure that the right things happened in the right ways at the right times. This implies institutions, not the formal institutions of a state, with written laws and named officials, but the informal institutions of a complex society, with understood roles and established practices and mechanisms for ensuring compliance. These people were not simple. They were not proto-humans stumbling toward civilization. They were people already embedded in a civilization of their own, one that had been developing for thousands of years and that had achieved levels of sophistication in certain domains: astronomy, landscape architecture, social organization at regional scale, that are genuinely impressive by any standard. When we fail to see that, when we describe them as primitive or as pre-civilized, we are not being accurate. We are letting our own cultural biases shape our reading of the evidence. We are mistaking difference for deficiency, treating the absence of the specific technologies and social forms that we associate with our own tradition as evidence of lack, rather than as evidence of a different set of priorities and a different set of achievements. The recalibration needed here is not minor. It requires genuinely questioning the assumption that civilization is a single path that all human societies travel, with some further along than others. It requires entertaining the possibility that there have been multiple paths, multiple ways of organizing complex human societies, and that some of those paths produced achievements that the mainstream of written history has consistently undervalued, because those achievements were built in forms that the mainstream tradition did not recognize or could not read. The megalithic monuments of Britain are legible now. We have learned enough over the past century of serious archaeological investigation to read them at least partially. We understand the astronomical alignments. We understand the scale and the logistics and the social organization they imply. We understand the long-distance connections they represent. We can read the monuments as the achievements they are, but for a very long time we could not. For most of the period since writing arrived in Britain, the monuments were treated as curiosities at best and as threats at worst, as things left by giants or by demons or by the devil, as things that needed to be explained away or neutralized or simply not thought about too carefully. The villagers who buried the stones at Avebury in the 14th century were responding to something they genuinely found threatening in the presence of those stones in their landscape. The medieval church that encouraged the burial of standing stones and the Christianization of sacred springs was responding to a competing sacred tradition that it recognized as real enough to be dangerous. What both of those responses tell us is that the monuments retained their power long after their builders were gone, long after anyone knew who had built them or why. The power was in the objects and in the places, not in any specific cultural tradition that could be suppressed or replaced. That is why the monuments terrified the Celts and unsettled the Romans and threatened the medieval church and continue to draw visitors today from every cultural background imaginable. The power is in the things themselves, and that power derives from one fundamental fact. The builders of these monuments understood something real. They understood the movement of the sun and the moon and the specific ways that those movements interacted with the local landscape at specific moments of the year. They understood this well enough to build structures that demonstrated that understanding with engineering precision, and the understanding and the demonstration of it remain true and remain compelling regardless of any specific cultural interpretation. The winter solstice is still the winter solstice. The sun still rises in the same places on the same morning every year. The light still enters Stonehenge at dawn in the same way it has entered it for 5,000 years. And if you stand there and watch it, you understand without needing any special knowledge that what you are witnessing was built for this moment. That someone, 5,000 years ago, stood in approximately this spot and watched the same sun rise and thought this moment is important enough to mark. This moment is important enough to build for. And then they built. That is why these places matter. That is why people travel from across the world to stand in them at the significant moments. That is why they have been maintained and visited and treated with special attention across every cultural transition this island has undergone. Because the understanding they encode is real and permanent and communicates itself to anyone willing to stand in the right place at the right time. The builders of prehistoric Britain gave us that. Across 5,000 years of change, across population replacements and cultural transformations and conquests and conversions. They gave us something that survived all of it, built it to survive, knew it would survive, and sent it forward in time to anyone who would come and stand in the right place and receive it. We are still receiving it. That is the most remarkable thing about the whole story. Not the engineering or the astronomy or the social organization or the scale of the monuments, impressive as all of those are. The most remarkable thing is the time. 5,000 years of a message continuing to arrive. 5,000 years of the light continuing to enter the stone and fall where it was intended to fall and do what it was built to do. The civilization that was here before the Romans and before the Celts did not fail. It ended as all civilizations end. The people who built it died and were replaced, genetically and culturally, by people who did not share their specific traditions or understand their specific cosmological frameworks. The civilization, in the conventional sense of a continuous living tradition, is gone, but what it built is not gone, and what it built continues to perform its intended function. That is a kind of success that very few civilizations achieve. Most things that humans build are gone within centuries. Stone lasts longer, but even stone erodes and falls. What lasts longest of all is not the physical object, but the relationship between the object and the phenomena it was built to frame. The relationship between Stonehenge and the winter solstice sunrise is not dependent on the state of the stones. Even in ruins, as long as the key alignments hold, the moment works. And the moment works. Still, after 5,000 years, in a world that has changed beyond any recognition the builders could have imagined. The solstice still comes, the light still enters, and whoever stands there to receive it, whatever their background and whatever they believe, and whatever they know or do not know about the people who built the monument, they receive something real. That is the legacy of the civilization that was in Britain, before the Romans, before the Celts, before writing and before iron, and before any of the things we call history. They built something that still works. They sent something forward in time that still arrives. And in doing so, they achieved what no subsequent civilization on this island has quite matched: permanence. Sleep carries you to the same place that the monument does, a place where time works differently, where the ordinary pressures and urgencies of waking life release their grip and something older and quieter takes over. The rhythm of breathing, the slow turning of the world, the patience of stone, that patience is here with you now. The old island holds you. The evidence from soil geochemistry around Stonehenge adds yet another dimension to what we already know. Geochemical analysis of soils in the Stonehenge area has revealed patterns of intensive human activity, burning and feasting, and the deposition of organic materials that extend well beyond the monument itself and across a much wider area of the surrounding landscape. This activity was not concentrated just at the monument, but was distributed across a landscape that had been heavily used for an extended period. Stonehenge was not an isolated temple in an empty landscape. It was the ceremonial center of an intensively managed and intensively inhabited territory. The isotope analysis of animal remains from Stonehenge itself, not just from Durrington walls, shows a similar pattern of long-distance movement. Animals brought from far away, materials brought from multiple geological zones. The monument was drawing resources from across the island and concentrating them at this specific location over an extended period. This does not happen without coordination, without the kind of ongoing social relationships that required specific people to travel to Stonehenge at specific times bringing specific things. Who were those people? We will never know their individual names or their individual stories, but in the aggregate, they are visible in the geochemical record, in the isotope signatures of the bones they left behind, in the variety of geological sources represented in the objects found at the site. They were people from across Britain who maintained a relationship with this place over generations, who kept coming back, who kept bringing things, who kept treating this specific intersection of landscape and sky as worth the journey. That persistence is itself remarkable. In a world without written reminders, without formal institutional structures to compel attendance, without any of the administrative mechanisms we associate with the maintenance of large religious institutions, people kept coming to Stonehenge for centuries. The reason they kept coming was the place itself, the experience of being there at the significant moments. The light and the stone and the alignment and whatever that combination produced in the people who witnessed it. The monument maintained its own magnetism across the generations, and it still does. The winter solstice gathering at Stonehenge today draws thousands of people who could read about the solstice alignment online, who could watch a video of the sunrise, but who choose instead to travel to this specific place and stand in the cold and the dark and wait for the light in the way that people have been waiting for it here for 5,000 years. The monument has not lost its power to draw people. It has not become merely historical. It remains, in some essential way, alive. That aliveness is the legacy of the people who built it. They built something that would stay alive, that would continue to do its work long after they were gone, that would continue to draw the attention and the presence of human beings across every cultural transformation of the island. They understood that the relationship between this place and the winter solstice was permanent, and they built to serve that relationship permanently. In building so, they achieved something that very few things in human history achieve. They became part of the world rather than just part of history. They built into the fabric of the British landscape, something that is as much a feature of that landscape now as the chalk itself, or the hills, or the river valleys. They made themselves, through their monuments, part of what Britain is. And in that, perhaps, they found what they were looking for, the permanence that human beings have always sought, the way of continuing to matter after the individual life is over. Not through text or through name or through memory, but through the enduring relationship between a carefully built thing and the permanent phenomena that it was built to frame. The light comes every solstice. The monument receives it. The long conversation between this human-built thing and the cosmos that surrounds it continues. That conversation began 5,000 years ago. It is ongoing, and we are witnesses to it, standing in the morning light at the solstice, receiving something that was built for us before we were born, receiving it and passing it on, as every generation has, to the people who will come after. The question of what specific knowledge the Druids carried and where it came from deserves more attention than it usually gets. We have established that classical sources place the Druidic origin tradition in Britain rather than in Gaul, and that the intellectual tradition of the Druids encompassed astronomy, cosmology, natural philosophy, law, and a vast corpus of oral literature. But the specifics of what that tradition actually contained, what the Druids knew and taught and practiced, is largely lost to us because the tradition was deliberately maintained in oral form and was never written down. This was not an oversight. The decision to keep the tradition oral, to prohibit its being written down, was a deliberate philosophical and practical choice. Classical sources report that the Druids believed that committing sacred knowledge to writing was inappropriate, that the act of writing fixed and reduced what should remain living and adaptable. This is a sophisticated position, not a primitive one. It reflects a genuine understanding of the difference between oral and written traditions, and a preference for the qualities of orality, flexibility, context dependence, the presence of the transmitter, the relationship between knowledge and performance, over the qualities of literacy. But it also meant that when the Druidic tradition was suppressed, first by the Romans and then by Christianity, what was lost was enormous. 20 years of intensive training, multiplied across generations of practitioners, multiplied across the entirety of the Celtic world. Gone. Not reduced, not transformed. Gone. The knowledge was not written down, and so when the transmission was broken, it was broken completely. What does that tell us? It tells us that most of what the Druids knew, we will never know. We have fragments preserved in the early Irish and Welsh texts of the medieval period, which contain traces of pre-Christian cosmological ideas. We have the classical accounts, which describe Druidic practices from the outside, filtered through the assumptions and priorities of Roman observers. We have the material culture of the Iron Age, which reflects aspects of the worldview of the Druidic tradition, even without making it explicit. And we have the landscape, the sacred geography that the Druids maintained, and that predated them by thousands of years. From all of this, we can construct something, a partial, fragmentary, probably significantly distorted picture of what the Druidic tradition contained. But the heart of it, the specific astronomical calculations, the cosmological framework that explained why the movements of the sun and the moon mattered, the relationship between the sacred places and the traditions maintained at them, the specific forms of the rituals and what they were understood to accomplish. All of that is gone. The loss is real. It should be grieved. Not in the abstract, academic sense of acknowledging that information is missing, but in the human sense of recognizing that something that mattered to real people, something that shaped their lives and their understanding of the world, was destroyed and cannot be recovered. The Druidic tradition was not a curiosity or an antiquarian object. It was a living knowledge system maintained by living people who cared about it and who understood it to be important. When it was destroyed, it was a human loss on a significant scale. We are left with what the Druids inherited, which is itself extraordinary. The monuments, the landscape, the sacred geography, the alignment of Stonehenge to the winter solstice, the alignment of Newgrange to the same moment, the alignment of Callanish to the major lunar standstill. These things do not depend on the Druidic tradition for their meaning. They have their own meaning, embedded in the relationship between stone and sky. Whatever the Druids understood about them, the monuments knew their own purpose, and that purpose is still legible. The alignment at Newgrange, in particular, is worth returning to in more detail. The monument is a passage tomb, which means its primary function, as understood by archaeologists, is as a chamber for the dead. The bones of multiple individuals were deposited in its chambers over its period of active use. But the winter solstice alignment, the precise engineering of the roof box above the entrance to channel the light of the rising sun on the shortest days of the year, down the full length of the 19-meter passage to illuminate the back chamber, is not a feature required by a burial monument. Many passage tombs have no such alignment. The alignment at Newgrange is a deliberate addition to the basic structure, a specific choice made by the builders to serve a purpose that went beyond simple burial. What purpose? The alignment connects the chamber of the dead to the moment of the solar year's turning. The winter solstice is the moment when the sun has retreated to its furthest point and begins its return. It is the turning point of the year, and at that turning point, the light of the newly returning sun enters the chamber where the dead rest. This is not random cosmological symbolism. This is a specific, carefully engineered statement about the relationship between death and the turning of the year, about what happens to the dead at the winter solstice, about the relationship between the retreat and return of the sun and whatever the builders understood to happen to human consciousness after death. We cannot read the specific theology, but we can read the structural choice. The builders of Newgrange wanted the winter solstice light to enter the burial chamber. They engineered it to do so with extraordinary precision, and that choice tells us that for them, the winter solstice and the state of the dead were connected in a way that was important enough to encode in the most permanent form available. Similar connections appear at other sites. At Maeshowe on Orkney, another passage tomb, the midwinter sun shines directly down the entrance passage and illuminates the back wall of the main chamber. At various chambered tombs across Britain and Ireland, orientations towards solar or lunar events suggest that the relationship between burial sites and astronomical phenomena was not incidental but central. What does this tell us about the beliefs of the people who built these monuments? It tells us that they understood the cosmos to be organized around rhythms, around cycles of retreat and return, around the turning of the year and the movement of celestial bodies. And it tells us that they understood the dead to be participants in those rhythms rather than simply absent. The dead were somewhere, in a relationship with the turning of the year, that the monuments were designed to mark and to maintain. This is not primitive animism in any pejorative sense. This is a sophisticated cosmological framework that integrated the human experience of death and the natural cycles of the cosmos into a unified understanding. The dead were not simply gone. They were part of the world's rhythms. And at the turning points of those rhythms, at the winter solstice when the sun returned, the monument brought the light of that return into the chamber where the dead rested. The Celts who inherited this sacred landscape and who populated it with the cedar, with the beings who lived beneath the mounds and who emerged at certain times of year, were preserving this intuition in mythological form. The mounds were places where something continued, where the dead were not simply absent, but present in some form that could be encountered under the right conditions. And the times of year when encounters were most likely, the liminal moments between seasons, corresponded in a general way to the astronomical alignments of the monuments. The great festival calendar of the Celts, with its 4 major celebrations marking the turning points of the agricultural and pastoral year, has been studied extensively. Samhain at the end of October, Imbolc in early February, Beltane in early May, Lugnasad in early August. These festivals mark not the solstices and equinoxes, but the points midway between them, the moments when one season definitively becomes another. And it is at these moments, particularly at Samhain, that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was understood to thin, that the Siddha were most active, that the dead could return and the living could cross over. Whether these festival dates connect to anything in the astronomical tradition of the monument builders is debated. The monuments themselves tend to be aligned to the solar solstices and equinoxes rather than to the midpoints between them. But the underlying principle of certain moments in the year being specially significant, of the calendar having liminal points where one state transitions into another, is consistent between the monument tradition and the Celtic festival tradition. Both traditions organize the year around turnings, around the moments when something changed direction. Perhaps the Celts, arriving in a landscape already organized by thousands of years of solar and lunar observation, absorbed the principle without inheriting the specific technical tradition. The principle that certain moments in the astronomical year were specially significant, that the world was organized by rhythms, and that the human relationship to those rhythms required ritual attention, was embedded in the landscape, in a form legible to anyone who paid attention. The specific tradition of observation and calculation that had produced the monument alignments was gone, but the principle survived in the monuments themselves and was absorbed, in modified form, into the Celtic tradition that replaced it. This is cultural transmission through landscape, rather than through direct human contact. The land itself carried something forward. The monuments were the medium through which an idea persisted across the population replacement that the genetics documents. Not perfectly, not completely, not in a form that preserved the full depth of the original understanding, but enough to keep the sense that the turning points of the year mattered, that the dead were in some relationship to those turnings, that certain places in the landscape were the appropriate sites for attention to these relationships, and from that sense, preserved imperfectly in myth and in the stubborn sacredness of ancient places. The Druidic tradition built whatever it built. We do not know precisely what, but we know it involved astronomy. We know it involved the land. We know it involved the management of the relationship between the living and the dead, and the world that lay beyond ordinary perception. And we know that it was important enough that the people who maintained it were regarded across the Celtic world as the most learned and most essential members of their society. The tradition that the Druids were practicing had roots that went back to the people who built the monuments. The specific techniques and the specific knowledge had changed, probably many times over, in the 2,000 or 3,000 years between the construction of Stonehenge and the encounter between the Druids and the Romans. But the underlying commitment to the land and to the sky and to the relationship between the human community and the rhythms that governed both was continuous. When the Romans suppressed the Druidic tradition, they suppressed the latest expression of a tradition that was already several thousand years old. They did not destroy the tradition's roots, which were embedded too deeply in the landscape to be eliminated by administrative order or by military force. What they destroyed was the living transmission, the chain of teachers and students through which the accumulated knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The knowledge died with the last generation of Druids who were trained before the suppression. What survived was the landscape, the monuments, the springs, the hills, the alignments, everything that the tradition had maintained, but that the tradition itself had not created. The created things outlasted the creators in ways that the Romans did not anticipate and could not prevent. The civilization that was in Britain before the Romans, and the tradition that the Celts built on the foundation of that civilization, left their marks on this island in ways that are still visible and still powerful. In the standing stones on the Orkney hilltops, and the chalk figures on the Sussex Downs and the aligned chambers of the Irish Passage, tombs and the springs that are still called holy in the Celtic Christian tradition. In the shapes of hills that have been ceremonially significant for so long that their significance has become simply part of what it is to look at them. In the quiet insistence of certain places that they are more than ordinary. These places are waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time. And when you come to them, whether you come knowing their history or simply drawn by something you cannot name, they recognize you. You are the continuation of the long story that began when the first human beings stood in this landscape and looked up at the sky and began the 10,000-year process of paying attention that produced, eventually, the monuments that still stand. You belong to this, and the old landscape belongs to you. Rest in that belonging. Rest in the quiet weight of all those years and all those generations of attention and care and building and maintaining and watching the sky. Rest in the knowledge that the light will come again at the solstice morning and enter the stone and fall where it was meant to fall, And you will be there, or someone will be there, as there has always been someone standing in the right place to receive it. The message continues. The transmission holds. The old civilization is still sending. Sleep now. The night is long and the stones are patient and the solstice will come in its own time. Let the rhythm of this ancient island carry you. You are in the right place. You have always been in the right place. Good night. The chalk beneath the turf of the British Downlands has been holding the shapes of what was built on it for 5,000 years. The sarsen stones have been standing through ice and thaw and centuries of slow weathering. The alignments have held through every political and cultural transformation the island has undergone. And the light, every winter solstice morning, comes through the gap in the stones exactly as it was built to do. In the silence of that moment, something is transmitted. Something that does not require language or cultural knowledge or any specific belief system. Something that simply requires presence. Being here, watching, and receiving.